The winter wind cut through Clara Hayes like a blade as Edward Collins stepped back from her, his face twisted in disgust. "You brought children?" He spat, loud enough for the entire platform to hear. "I never agreed to raise another man's bastards." In that moment, with her 6-month-old twins crying in the bitter Dakota cold and dozens of townspeople watching her humiliation, Clara realized her last hope for survival had just crumbled to dust. Stay with me to discover how one woman's darkest moment became her greatest triumph. And don't forget to comment which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The train's whistle pierced the frozen morning air as it pulled into Riverbend Station, black smoke billowing against the pewter sky. Clara Hayes pressed her face against the frost-covered window, her breath fogging the glass as she searched the platform for the man who would be her salvation. 6 months had passed since cholera took her husband, leaving her with nothing but debts, 2 infant children, and a bundle of letters from a merchant named Edward Collins, who promised her a new life in Dakota Territory. "Almost there, my loves," she whispered to the bundles in her arms. Little Thomas stirred against her chest while Emma slept peacefully, blissfully unaware that their entire future depended on the next few minutes. The train lurched to a stop with a mechanical groan that seemed to echo Clara's own exhaustion. She'd sold everything, her mother's china, her wedding ring, even her winter coat, to afford the passage from Missouri. The thin shawl around her shoulders did little to ward off the December cold seeping through the train car's walls. But she'd endured worse. She'd survived her husband's death, survived the creditors who'd tried to take her children, survived the shame of begging distant relatives for help only to be turned away. Edward Collins represented more than marriage. He represented survival itself. Clara gathered her meager possessions, one worn carpet bag containing 2 changes of clothes, a Bible, and the precious packet of letters tied with string. The other passengers gave her a wide berth as she made her way down the aisle, some with pity in their eyes, others with the kind of judgment reserved for young widows traveling alone. She'd grown accustomed to both. The platform stretched before her like a stage set for Judgment Day. Snow swirled in violent eddies, and the wind howled between the buildings of Riverbend's main street. The town looked exactly as Edward had described in his letters: a growing frontier settlement with a general store, a church, a schoolhouse, and promise of prosperity for those willing to work hard. But Clara barely noticed the buildings, her attention fixed on the cluster of people gathered near the station house, and at their center, a man in an expensive black wool coat. Edward Collins stood taller than she'd imagined, broader too, with sandy hair slicked back with pomade and a gold watch chain glinting across his vest. He looked prosperous, respectable, everything his letters had promised. But as Clara stepped off the train, something in his expression shifted. His eyes, which she'd imagined would be warm and welcoming, turned cold as they traveled from her face to the bundles in her arms. "Mr. Collins?" Clara's voice came out smaller than intended, nearly lost in the wind. "I'm Clara Hayes." He didn't move toward her, didn't offer to take her bag, didn't smile. "Mrs. Hayes," the words came out flat, careful. "You didn't mention children in your letters." The platform seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. I did, sir. In my 3rd letter. I wrote that I had 2 infants, Thomas and Emma. You replied that you understood my situation." "I understood you were a widow," Edward said, his voice rising enough that the gathered townspeople leaned in closer. "I did not understand you intended to bring another man's children into my household." Clara's arms tightened around her babies instinctively. Thomas began to fuss, sensing his mother's distress. "They're my children, Mr. Collins. My late husband's children. Surely you understood." "I understood nothing of the sort." Edward's face flushed red despite the cold. "A widow, yes. A woman with experience running a household, certainly. But I'm not raising another man's offspring. I need sons of my own blood to inherit my business, not charity cases eating at my table." The words hit Clara like physical blows. Around them, the crowd had grown. Women in their Sunday best, despite it being Thursday. Men who'd mysteriously found urgent business near the depot, children peering out from behind their mother's skirts. She recognized the scenario for what it was: public entertainment in a small town where gossip served as currency. Please, Clara said, hating the desperation creeping into her voice. We've come so far, I sold everything. You promised? I promised nothing to a deceiver, Edward cut her off. You misrepresented yourself, madam. I advertised for a wife, not a ready-made family with another man's whelps. Emma began crying now too, a thin wail that seemed to emphasize their vulnerability. The wind picked up, driving snow into Clara's face, and she realized with growing horror that she had no money for a return ticket, no relatives to wire for help, nowhere to go in this frozen wilderness. Mr. Collins, please be reasonable, she tried again. The children are no trouble. They're good babies, quiet babies. They won't interfere with— The matter is closed. Edward turned to a woman beside him, elegant in blue silk despite the weather, his sister Clara realized, remembering she'd been mentioned in the letters. Vivian, we're leaving. But Edward, Vivian Collins said, though her tone suggested amusement rather than concern, you can't simply leave her here. She made her choices, Edward replied coldly. Deception has consequences. He turned to go, but Clara's desperation overtook her pride. She grabbed his sleeve with her free hand. Please, at least let us stay somewhere for the night. The children, it's so cold. Edward jerked his arm away as if her touch had burned him. That's no concern of mine. You should have thought of that before attempting to trap me into raising bastards. The word rang out across the platform like a gunshot. Clara gasped, and several women in the crowd did too, though whether from genuine shock or theatrical sensibility was unclear. How dare you? Clara whispered, but her voice gained strength as maternal fury overtook fear. How dare you call my children that? They had a father, a good man who died serving others during the cholera outbreak. They are not bastards, and I am not a deceiver. I told you about them. You chose to ignore it because it didn't suit your plans. Edward's face darkened further. Watch your tongue, woman. You're in my town now. Your town? A new voice interrupted. I wasn't aware you'd been elected mayor, Collins. The crowd parted to reveal a woman in her 60s, sturdy as an oak tree despite her gray hair, wearing a practical brown dress and a no-nonsense expression. She walked with the confidence of someone who'd faced down blizzards, outlaws, and pompous merchants without flinching. Mrs. Grant, Edward said stiffly, this doesn't concern you. A woman and 2 infants stranded in a blizzard concerns any Christian soul, Martha Grant replied. She looked at Clara with shrewd but kind eyes. You need somewhere to stay, dear? I don't have much money, Clara admitted, her cheeks burning with shame. Didn't ask about money. Asked if you needed help. Martha moved closer, ignoring Edward entirely now. I run the boarding house on 2nd Street. It's warm, and I've got stew on the stove. Martha, Vivian Collins interjected with a tinkling laugh that sounded like ice breaking. Surely you're not taking in strays now. What will people say? People will say Martha Grant continues to show Christian charity while others flap their gums, Martha shot back. Come along, dear. Let's get those babies out of this wind. Clara hesitated, looking between Edward's furious face and Martha's outstretched hand. Pride warred with necessity, but Thomas's increasingly urgent cries made the decision for her. Thank you, she said to Martha, then turned to Edward one last time. I pity the woman who does marry you, Mr. Collins. She'll discover too late that your heart is as frozen as this platform. She didn't wait for his response, instead following Martha Grant away from the station, away from the crowd, away from the ruins of her carefully laid plans. Behind them, she could hear the explosion of whispers, the gossip already spreading like wildfire through Riverbend. Martha's boarding house sat 3 blocks from the station, a 2-story clapboard building painted cheerful yellow despite the harsh climate. A sign reading, Grant's Rest, clean beds, hot meals, swung in the wind above the door. The windows glowed with lamplight, promising warmth within. Let's get you settled first, then we'll talk, Martha said, ushering Clara through the front door into a parlor that smelled of wood polish and bread baking. The sudden warmth made Clara's eyes water, or perhaps that was just the tears she'd been holding back finally breaking free. The interior of Grant's Rest was everything the outside promised, clean, comfortable, and welcoming. Handmade quilts draped over horsehair furniture, daguerreotypes of stern-faced relatives decorated the walls, and a fire crackled merrily in the stone fireplace. Sit, Martha commanded, guiding Clara to a chair nearest the fire. Let me see those little ones. Clara surrendered Emma to Martha's experienced hands while she soothed Thomas. The older woman examined the baby girl with the practiced eye of someone who'd raised children of her own. Healthy, despite the cold, Martha pronounced. How old? 6 months. They were born in June, right before... Clara trailed off, unable to finish. Before your husband passed, Martha said gently. The cholera took many good men last summer. I'm sorry for your loss. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. The kindness after Edward's cruelty threatened to undo her completely. Now then, Martha said, settling Emma back into Clara's arms and bustling toward the kitchen. You need food, warmth, and rest, in that order. We'll figure out the rest later. Mrs. Grant, I need to be honest with you. I have perhaps $3 to my name. I can't pay for... Did I ask for payment? Martha called from the kitchen. Lord knows I've got empty rooms and too much stew for one old woman. You'll earn your keep when you're able. For now, you're a guest. Clara wanted to protest, to maintain some shred of dignity, but exhaustion won. She sat by the fire, her children finally quiet in her arms, and let the warmth seep into her bones. Through the window, she could see snow beginning to fall in earnest, and she shuddered to think what would have become of them if Martha Grant hadn't intervened. Martha returned with a tray bearing 2 bowls of thick beef stew, fresh bread, and a pot of tea. Eat, she ordered. You're no good to those babies if you faint from hunger. Clara hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful of stew hit her stomach. She'd been surviving on anxiety and determination for so long that she'd forgotten what actual food tasted like. Martha held Thomas while Clara ate, cooing at the baby with a grandmother's instinct. He's got your eyes, Martha observed. But the nose is all his father's, I'd wager. Yes, Clara said softly. James had a prominent nose. He used to joke that Thomas would grow into it eventually. Tell me about him. Your husband. It was the first time in months anyone had asked about James as a person rather than as an excuse for her circumstances. Clara found herself talking between bites of stew, telling Martha about the young doctor who'd courted her with books of poetry and promises of adventure, who'd insisted on treating cholera patients even when other physicians fled, who'd held his children once, just once, before the fever took him. A good man, Martha said when Clara finished. The kind we need more of out here. And you? What did you do before? I helped James with his practice. I can read and write, do figures. I learned some nursing, though I'm not trained properly. Clara hesitated, then added, I thought Mr. Collins needed help with his store's books. That's what his advertisement said. He needed a wife who could help with business. Martha snorted. Edward Collins needs help, all right, but not with his books. That man's problem is he thinks the world owes him perfection on a silver platter. His first wife died 3 years back. Sweet little thing, but frail. No children. He's been advertising for a new wife for 2 years, but every woman in town knows better, and most who come from outside don't meet his standards. He seems so different in his letters, Clara said, pulling out the packet. Kind, thoughtful even. Oh, he can play the gentleman when it suits him, but the moment something doesn't go exactly to his specifications? Martha shook her head. You saw that side today. Count yourself lucky, dear. Marriage to Edward Collins would have been its own kind of death. Clara wanted to feel lucky, but with $3, 2 infants, and no prospects, luck seemed in short supply. Martha must have read her thoughts on her face. Now, none of that despair, the older woman said briskly. You're alive, your babies are healthy, and you're not facing this blizzard alone. That's more than many can say. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps. Tonight, you rest. She led Clara upstairs to a small but clean room with a brass bed, a washstand, and blessed luxury, a small stove already warming the space. A drawer had been lined with blankets to serve as a makeshift cradle for the twins. This was my daughter's room, Martha said quietly. She married a railroad man, lives in Chicago now. It's good to have children in it again. Clara set the twins in their improvised bed, watching them settle into sleep with the resilience of the very young. Mrs. Grant, why are you doing this? You don't know me. I could be exactly what Mr. Collins said, a deceiver, I know enough, Martha interrupted. I know you came 1,000 miles on a promise. I know you faced down Edward Collins and his harpy of a sister with more backbone than most would manage. And I know those babies are loved, which is more than some can say. That's enough character reference for me. She paused at the door. There's water in the pitcher for washing, and I'll bring up some warm milk for the babies if they wake in the night. Sleep now. The world will still be there in the morning, and it might look different after rest. But sleep didn't come easily for Clara. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to her children's breathing and the wind howling outside, replaying the scene at the station. How had she misjudged so badly? She'd been so careful, had asked all the right questions in her letters. Edward had seemed genuinely interested in her experience helping James, had written eloquently about building a life together, about understanding the challenges of frontier living. Had she been so desperate that she'd seen what she wanted to see? Or had Edward simply been that good at deception while accusing her of the same? The twins stirred around midnight, and Clara rose to feed them the warm milk Martha had indeed brought up. As she held them in the rocking chair by the window, looking out at the snow-covered streets of Riverbend, she made a decision. She would not go back. Whatever it took, however hard she had to work, she would make a life here. Not because of Edward Collins, but in spite of him. The next morning brought clear skies and crystalline cold. Clara woke to the smell of bacon and coffee, sounds of life stirring in the boarding house below. The twins were still sleeping, exhausted from yesterday's ordeal, and Clara took the opportunity to wash and dress with care. She might be destitute, but she wouldn't look defeated. The dining room held several other boarders, a surveyor heading further west, 2 salesmen comparing territory notes, and an elderly woman Martha introduced as Mrs. Henley, a permanent resident. They all looked up when Clara entered, and she knew immediately that everyone had heard about yesterday's scene at the depot. "The woman of the hour," one of the salesmen said with a smirk. "Heard you gave Edward Collins quite the set-down." "Mr. Patterson," Martha said sharply, "Mrs. Hayes is my guest and will be treated with respect, or you'll be finding other accommodations." Patterson raised his hands in surrender, but Clara caught the speculative look he gave her. She understood. She was now part of Riverbend's story, the abandoned mail-order bride who dared to talk back to one of the town's prominent citizens. The narrative was already being written, and she had little control over it. After breakfast, during which the other boarders carefully avoided mentioning her situation while obviously dying to discuss it, Martha pulled Clara aside. "I've been thinking," she said. "You need work, and it so happens I know someone who needs help. Can you handle the sight of blood?" "I helped James with surgery when his regular nurse was ill," Clara replied. "I've seen plenty." "Good. Dr. Nathaniel Ward lost his nurse last month when she married and moved to California. He's been managing alone, but it's wearing on him. He might be willing to take on someone with your experience." Clara's heart leaped. Medical work was something she understood, something she was good at. Would he accept a woman with children? Nathaniel Ward is different from most men in town. He's got his own sorrows and tends to judge people by their actions, not their circumstances. Worth a try, at least. Martha gave her directions to Dr. Ward's office, just off Main Street, and offered to watch the twins. "Better you make this first impression without distractions," she said wisely. Clara walked through Riverbend's streets with her head high, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed her. The town was larger than she'd initially thought, with several blocks of businesses, a bank, a small hospital, and houses spreading out toward the prairie. Signs of prosperity were everywhere. New construction, fresh paint, well-dressed citizens despite the frontier setting. Dr. Parmasum. Ward's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story brick building, one of the few brick structures in town. A simple bronze plaque beside the door read, "Nathaniel Ward, M.D." Clara took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts, and knocked. "Come in," a deep voice called from within. The waiting room was empty but spotless, with medical journals stacked neatly on a side table and anatomical charts on the walls. The familiar smell of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs brought an unexpected wave of homesickness for James's practice. "I'll be just a moment," the voice called from an inner office. Clara heard water splashing, then footsteps. The man who emerged was nothing like James. Where her husband had been slight and scholarly, Dr. Nathaniel Ward stood well over 6 feet with the broad shoulders of someone who'd done physical labor before taking up medicine. His dark hair was slightly mussed, his sleeves rolled up revealing strong forearms, and his gray eyes held a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He stopped short when he saw her. "Mrs. Hayes." Clara's stomach sank. Of course he'd already heard. "Dr. Ward, I apologize for coming unannounced, but Mrs. Grant suggested you might need—" "I was at the station yesterday," he said quietly. "Not by design. I was returning from a house call when the train arrived. I saw what happened." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. "Then you know my circumstances." "I know Edward Collins is a fool." The blunt statement surprised a small gasp from Clara. Dr. Ward continued, "I also know you have medical experience. Martha sent a note this morning." "He did?" "Martha Grant doesn't do things by half. Said you helped your late husband's practice, have steady hands, and can read and write. That already makes you more qualified than most who've applied." Clara straightened. "I can do more than that. I can prepare medications, maintain inventory, assist with surgery, and handle patient records. I know the difference between laudanum and belladonna, can suture wounds, and have delivered 3 babies successfully." Something shifted in Dr. Ward's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. 3 deliveries? 2 with James, 1 on my own when he was treating cholera patients. The mother and child both survived. He studied her for a long moment, and Clara resisted the urge to fidget under his scrutiny. She noticed the shadows under his eyes, the slight tremor in his left hand that suggested exhaustion or perhaps too much coffee. "When did you last sleep properly, doctor?" she asked, before she could stop herself. His eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon?" "You have the look of someone who's been running on determination alone for too long. James had the same look before I started forcing him to maintain regular hours. And how did you manage that?" "I scheduled his appointments to allow for meal breaks, prepared food he could eat quickly between patients, and occasionally lied about the urgency of house calls to give him time to rest." To her surprise, Dr. Ward smiled, a brief, rusty expression that transformed his austere features. "You managed a doctor before." "I did. A stubborn one who thought the world would end if he took 10 minutes for lunch." "The world might not end, but patients don't stop needing help just because a doctor needs food," he said, but there was no real argument in his tone. "No, but a doctor who collapses from exhaustion helps no one," Clara countered. "James learned that lesson the hard way when he fainted during a tooth extraction. The patient had to revive him. This time Dr. Ward actually chuckled, though it sounded like a skill he hadn't practiced in some time. "Point taken. The position pays $15 a month plus room and board. The rooms are upstairs, nothing fancy, but there's space for children. Hours are long, work can be difficult, and some patients will object to being treated by a woman, even as an assistant." "That's generous," Clara said, trying to keep the relief out of her voice. It was more than generous. It was salvation. "But I should tell you, Dr. Ward, that I have 2 infants, 6 months old. They're generally quiet, but children don't trouble me, Mrs. Hayes. This building has thick walls, and babies' cries are far more pleasant than some sounds I've heard in my career." He paused, something flickering across his face too quickly for Clara to read. "When can you start?" "Immediately, if needed." "Good. We have a surgery scheduled for this afternoon. Abscess drainage, nothing complex, but I could use an extra pair of hands. Consider it a trial. If it goes well, the position is yours." Clara wanted to weep with relief but maintained her composure. "Thank you, Dr. Ward. You won't regret this." "We'll see," he said, but not unkindly. "Can you return at 2 o'clock?" "I'll be here." She turned to leave, then looked back. "May I ask why you're willing to take a chance on me?" "After what happened yesterday, most people in town would consider me a liability." Dr. Ward was quiet for so long, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Because I know what it's like to lose everything and have to start over. And because Edward Collins' opinion of someone is usually inversely proportional to their actual worth." Clara left the office with a lighter step than she'd had in months. She had work, real work that she understood and was good at. It wouldn't be easy. She could already imagine the gossip about the scandalous widow working for the unmarried doctor, But she'd faced worse. The surgery that afternoon went smoothly. Clara fell into the familiar rhythm of assisting, anticipating the doctor's needs, maintaining sterile conditions as much as possible, keeping the patient calm. Dr. Ward worked with precision and economy of movement, clearly skilled beyond what one might expect in a frontier town. "You've trained at a proper hospital," Clara observed as she cleaned instruments afterward. "Johns Hopkins, then 2 years in Chicago," he confirmed. "Before I came west." She wanted to ask why someone with such credentials was practicing in Riverbend, but his closed expression suggested that was a story for another time, if ever. Over the following days, Clara established a routine. She would arrive at the office before dawn, bringing the twins to stay in a small room Dr. Ward had cleared for them adjacent to the main office. Between patients, she could check on them, and their presence seemed to brighten the austere medical practice. Even Dr. Ward, for all his reserve, had been caught making faces at Thomas when he thought Clara wasn't looking. The work was demanding but satisfying. Clara rediscovered skills she'd thought lost with James, and learned new ones from Dr. Ward's more formal training. He was a patient teacher when he realized she genuinely wanted to learn, explaining procedures and treatments with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely had an interested audience. But the gossip, as Clara had predicted, was vicious. "Living above an unmarried man's office," she heard Vivian Collins saying loudly in the general store one morning, "with those poor children exposed to God knows what improprieties." "Dr. Ward is a respected professional," Clara said coolly, not bothering to lower her voice. "And my children are exposed to nothing more scandalous than the occasional case of measles." Vivian's eyes glittered with malice. "My dear, you can't possibly think this arrangement is appropriate. What would your late husband think?" "He would think I was fortunate to find employment that allows me to use my skills while providing for our children," Clara replied. James believed in practical solutions over pearl-clutching propriety. "Such language." Vivian pressed a hand to her chest. "No wonder Edward refused." "Edward refused because he's a coward who wants a wife he can mold like clay, not a woman with her own thoughts," Clara interrupted. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." She left Vivian sputtering and several other shoppers hiding smiles behind their hands. But Clara knew she'd made an enemy, and Vivian Collins had influence in Riverbend. The campaign against her started subtly. Patients began canceling appointments, claiming they were uncomfortable with a woman assistant. Suppliers became reluctant to extend credit for medical supplies. Someone left a dead cat on the office doorstep with a note reading, "Jezebel." Dr. Ward's reaction to the harassment surprised Clara. Where she expected him to distance himself, perhaps even reconsider her employment, he instead became fiercely protective. "Mrs. Collins," he said coldly when Vivian arrived for her weekly tonic, "I'm afraid I can no longer treat you." "I beg your pardon?" Vivian's face went white with shock. "Find another physician. Perhaps one whose staff meets your moral standards. You can't refuse to treat me." "I can, and I will." "Good day." Word of the confrontation spread quickly, dividing the town. Some sided with the Collins siblings, viewing Clara as a threat to moral order. Others, particularly the working families who relied on Dr. Ward's reasonable prices and willingness to accept payment in trade, supported their doctor's choice. Through it all, Clara focused on her work and her children. The twins thrived in their new environment and even began to bring unexpected joy to the practice. Patients who might have been nervous about procedures found themselves distracted by Emma's gummy smiles or Thomas's determined attempts to crawl. One evening, about 3 weeks after Clara started working, she was organizing supplies when Dr. Ward emerged from his office looking more haggard than usual. "Bad news?" Clara asked gently. He held up a letter. "From Chicago. A colleague writing to inform me that my former fiancé has married. He thought I should hear it from a friend." Clara's hand stilled on the medicine bottles. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was inevitable. She couldn't understand why I left Chicago, why I needed—" He trailed off, staring at nothing. "Why you needed to be somewhere else," Clara finished softly. "Somewhere without memories." His sharp gaze focused on her. "Yes. James and I were planning to move west before he died," Clara said, surprising herself with the confession. He said fresh starts were easier where the past couldn't follow you. I'm beginning to think he was wrong. The past follows regardless. It just matters whether you let it define you. And what defines you, Mrs. Hayes? Clara considered the question. My children. My work. The future I'm building despite everyone expecting me to fail. Including Edward Collins. Especially Edward Collins. Dr. Ward smiled then, that rare expression that made him look years younger. He came by yesterday, demanded I fire you for the good of my practice. Clara's heart sank. And? I told him that my practice has never run more efficiently. My patients, the ones who matter, are happier, and if he had a problem with my staffing choices, he was welcome to travel 50 miles to the next nearest doctor. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. His tone brooked no argument. Clara, Mrs. Hayes, you're the best assistant I've had. More than that, you're becoming a real medical practitioner. Don't let small-minded fools drive you away from work you're meant to do. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and Clara felt something shift between them, some barrier thinning. Nathaniel, she said, testing the familiarity. Thank you. He nodded, color rising slightly in his cheeks, and retreated to his office. But the moment lingered, a promise of something that might grow if given time and care. The crisis came, as Clara had half expected, from the Collins siblings' determination to force her out of Riverbend. But she hadn't anticipated the form it would take. She was returning from a house call. Dr. Ward had begun trusting her with simple cases, when she found Sheriff McKenna waiting at the office. Mrs. Hayes, he said, looking uncomfortable, I need to speak with you. What's wrong? Fear clutched at her throat. The children. Your children are fine. They're with Mrs. Grant, but I've received a formal complaint. Mr. Collins claims you stole from him. What? Clara's legs nearly gave out. That's absurd. I've never taken anything from Edward Collins. He says you took money he provided for your passage here, that it was a loan you were meant to repay through marriage, and since you refused to honor the agreement, McKenna spread his hands helplessly. He's demanding restitution or arrest. He sent me nothing. I paid my own way with everything I had left. Can you prove that? Clara's mind raced. The ticket stubs were long gone, used for kindling on the train. She had no receipts, no witnesses to her transactions in Missouri. This is extortion, Dr. Ward said from behind her. Clara hadn't heard him arrive. Collins is using the law to harass Mrs. Hayes because she wounded his pride. Maybe so, McKenna said, but he's within his rights to file a complaint. Unless Mrs. Hayes can prove she didn't take his money, I'll have to arrest her. Trial's set for next week. How much? Doctor, Ward asked quietly. He claims $200. Clara gasped. It might as well have been $2,000. I don't have anything close to that. You have a week to figure something out, McKenna said apologetically. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes. For what it's worth, nobody believes Collins. But the law is the law. After the sheriff left, Clara sank into a chair, shaking. Just when she'd begun to build something, to create stability for her children, it was being ripped away. We'll fight this, Dr. Ward said firmly. With what? I have no proof, no money for a lawyer. Edward Collins owns half this town. Who's going to stand up for a widow with no connections? I will. Clara looked up at him, this man she'd known for less than a month but who'd shown her more kindness than most. You've already done enough. This could damage your practice, your reputation. My reputation. Nathaniel laughed bitterly. Clara, I came to Riverbend because my reputation in Chicago was already in ruins. My wife and son died of typhoid while I was attending a medical conference. I couldn't save them. The great Dr. Ward from Johns Hopkins couldn't save his own family. My fiancée left me because she said I'd become a ghost, and she was right. I've been dead inside for 3 years. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Until you arrived. You and your children, you've brought life back into this tomb I've been existing in. I won't let Collins destroy that. I won't let him destroy you. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Nathaniel, marry me. The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their suddenness. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated more steadily. A wife can't be compelled to repay her husband's supposed debts. It would void Colin's claim immediately. That's not a reason to marry someone." "No," Nathaniel agreed, "but protecting someone you've come to care for is. Giving children a stable home is. Building a partnership based on respect and shared purpose is." He squeezed her hands gently. "I'm not Edward Collins, Clara. I'm not asking you to be a decoration or a servant. I'm asking you to be my partner in the practice and in life. You barely know me. I know you work 16-hour days without complaint. I know you sing to your children when you think no one's listening. I know you treat every patient with dignity, whether they're the mayor or a traveling vagrant. I know you make me want to be better than I've been." His gray eyes were intense, sincere. "What else do I need to know?" Clara's heart raced. It was insane marrying a man she'd known for 3 weeks. But hadn't she traveled 1,000 miles to marry a stranger? And Nathaniel had proven himself in ways Edward never could have. "The children are delightful. I've always wanted children. The fact that they're already here, already perfect, seems like a gift. People will talk. They'll say I seduced you, that I'm a fortune hunter. Let them talk. The people who matter, Martha Grant, the families we treat, our real friends, they'll know better." Clara studied his face, searching for doubt, for regret, for any sign this was a momentary impulse. She found only determination and something that might have been hope. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. But Nathaniel—" He silenced her with a gentle kiss, brief but full of promise. "No buts. We'll figure out the rest as we go." The next morning, Nathaniel marched into Edward Collins' store with Clara beside him. The merchant looked up from his ledger with a smug smile that faltered when he saw their joined hands. "Collins," Nathaniel said pleasantly, "I hear you're claiming my fiancé owes you money." "Your fiancé?" Edward's face went through several colors. "Yes. We're to be married tomorrow. Judge Morrison has agreed to perform the ceremony. And as I understand the law, a husband assumes all his wife's debts upon marriage. So if you'd like to present your evidence of this loan to me, I'll be happy to review it." You can't. This is highly irregular." "No more irregular than attempting to extort money from a widow," Clara said coolly. "Unless you have actual proof of this supposed debt, I suggest you withdraw your complaint." Edward's jaw worked furiously. "You think you've won something? Marrying a disgraced doctor who couldn't even save his own family? You deserve each other." Nathaniel stepped forward, and for a moment Clara thought he might strike Edward. Instead, he said very quietly, "You're right. We do deserve each other. We deserve happiness, which is something you'll never understand, Edward. You had a chance at something real with Clara, and you threw it away because your pride mattered more than possibility. That's your loss, not ours." They left Edward standing speechless in his store, and by noon, Sheriff McKenna informed them the complaint had been withdrawn. The wedding was small, held in Martha Grant's parlor with only a handful of witnesses: Martha herself, Dr. Ward's one close friend in town, a retired cavalry officer named Captain Brooks, and Mrs. Henley from the boarding house. The twins gurgled happily in Martha's arms as Judge Morrison performed the ceremony. Clara wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that had survived the journey from Missouri. Nathaniel had somehow procured a small bouquet of dried wildflowers, and his hands were steady as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. "I know this isn't the wedding you might have dreamed of," he said softly as they signed the marriage certificate. "My dreams were never about the wedding," Clara replied. "They were about finding someone who would see me as a partner, not a possession. Someone who would love my children as their own. Someone I could build something meaningful with. And have you found that?" Clara looked at this man who'd taken such an enormous leap of faith for her, who'd risked his reputation and his practice to protect her from injustice. "I believe I have." That evening, as they settled into the apartment above the practice, now officially their home, Clara found herself watching Nathaniel with the twins. He held Emma with natural ease, making silly faces that drew delighted squeals, while Thomas grabbed at his watch chain with determined little fingers. "They'll need a proper nursery," he said, "and we should think about hiring a girl to help during office hours. Mrs. Patterson's daughter is looking for work." "You've thought about this?" "I've thought about a lot of things since you arrived." He looked up at her, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "Clara, I want you to know I don't expect, that is, this marriage doesn't have to be—" "Nathaniel," she interrupted gently, moving to sit beside him. "We have time. Whatever this becomes, we have time to let it grow naturally." He nodded, relief visible in his features. It's been a long time since I let anyone close." "For me too, in different ways." She touched his hand. "But maybe that's why this works. We both know what loss feels like. We both know that life is too short and too unpredictable to waste on other people's expectations." "To hell with other people's expectations," Nathaniel said with unusual vehemence, making Clara laugh. "Language, Dr. Ward. What will the children think? That their father doesn't suffer fools gladly." The word father slipped out naturally, and Nathaniel colored slightly. "That is, if you're comfortable with— They need a father," Clara said simply, "and I can't think of a better one." As if in agreement, Thomas reached for Nathaniel with both chubby arms, and the doctor gathered him close with a tenderness that made Clara's heart ache in the best way. The first weeks of marriage were an adjustment. Clara had been on her own for months, making every decision independently, and now she had to remember she was part of a partnership. Nathaniel, for his part, had been solitary for so long that having a family in his space sometimes startled him, though never unpleasantly. They developed routines. Clara would wake early to tend the children and start breakfast while Nathaniel reviewed patient files for the day. They worked side by side in the practice, their professional rhythm translating surprisingly well to domestic life. Evenings were spent quietly, Nathaniel reading medical journals aloud while Clara mended clothes or played with the twins, a peaceful domesticity neither had expected to find again. The town's reaction was mixed, but largely predictable. The Collins faction made their displeasure known through snubs and whispers, but their influence was waning. More and more families appreciated the expanded services the practice could offer with Clara's assistance, and the sight of Dr. Ward as a family man actually increased his standing among many citizens. "It's good to see him smile again," Captain Brooks told Clara one afternoon when he came for treatment of an old war wound. "I've known Nathaniel since he arrived in Riverbend, and I've never seen him as alive as he's been these past weeks." But it was Martha Grant who perhaps summed it up best. "You two make sense," she said simply. "Not the storybook kind of sense, but the real kind. The kind that lasts." Clara thought about that as she watched Nathaniel teaching Thomas to stack wooden blocks one evening, patient with the baby's uncoordinated attempts. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd answered Edward Collins' advertisement. It was better, real and complicated, and theirs. The crisis that truly cemented their bond came 6 weeks after their marriage. Scarlet fever struck Riverbend with a vengeance, and the practice was overwhelmed with sick children. Clara and Nathaniel worked 18-hour days, barely sleeping, tag-teaming care for their own children while treating dozens of others. It was during this epidemic that Clara proved her true worth to the town. While Nathaniel handled the most severe cases, Clara organized a quarantine system, taught mothers how to recognize early symptoms, and established a supply chain for medicines. Her calm efficiency in the face of crisis earned respect from even her harshest critics, but the personal cost was nearly devastating. Emma fell ill on the 10th day of the outbreak. Clara found her burning with fever one morning, the characteristic rash spreading across her tiny chest. The terror that gripped her was paralyzing. She'd seen too many children die from this disease. "We're not losing her," Nathaniel said firmly, though Clara could see his own fear. "We know what to do. We've saved dozens of children already." "Other people's children," Clara whispered. "It's different when it's your own." "Yes," he agreed, and she realized he was speaking from experience. "But that's why we'll fight harder." They battled for Emma's life for 4 days. Clara never left her side, spooning water and medicine into her tiny mouth, bathing her fevered skin, singing the lullabies that had soothed her since birth. Nathaniel worked himself to exhaustion treating other patients during the day, then sat up with Emma at night so Clara could rest, though she rarely did. On the fourth night, Emma's fever broke. She opened her eyes, focused and clear, and reached for Clara with a weak but determined gesture. Clara sobbed with relief, and when she looked up, she saw tears on Nathaniel's cheeks as well. "Thank you," she whispered. "We did it together," he replied, pulling her into his arms. "That's what partners do." It was then, holding each other in the dim nursery with their daughter, breathing steadily in her crib, that Clara realized she loved him. Not the desperate, grasping love she'd been prepared to manufacture for Edward Collins out of necessity, but something deeper and truer. Love born of shared purpose, mutual respect, and the choice to build something together despite the odds. "I love you," she said into his shoulder. His arms tightened around her. "I love you too. I think I have since you told Edward Collins you pitied whoever married him." Clara laughed through her tears. "That wasn't my finest moment. It was magnificent." "You were magnificent. You still are." He kissed her then, not the brief, careful touches they'd shared since marriage, but something deeper, full of promise and passion, and the peculiar joy that comes from finding love when you'd stopped looking for it. The fever broke in Riverbend as it had in Emma, suddenly and completely. The town emerged battered but grateful, and the practice of Doctor's Ward, for that's how the town had begun referring to them both, despite Clara's lack of formal degree, was at the center of their gratitude. Edward Collins, of all people, appeared at their door one evening as Clara was closing the office. "Mrs. Ward," he said stiffly, "I need to speak with you." Clara's instinct was to refuse, but something in his demeanor, a humility she'd never seen before, made her pause. "Come in." He entered awkwardly, hat in hands. "My nephew is ill. In Denver, my sister's boy. They say it's consumption and the doctor's there." He swallowed hard. "Vivian is beside herself. I wondered, that is, I hoped, would Dr. Ward be willing to correspond with the Denver physicians? Perhaps suggest alternative treatments?" Clara could have savored this moment, could have made him grovel. Instead, she said, "Write down the boy's symptoms and the Denver doctor's name. Nathaniel will review everything and send recommendations by tomorrow's post." Edward's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you. I know I have no right to ask for kindness from you." "No," Clara agreed. "You don't. But that child does. And we're doctors, Mr. Collins. We help those who need it, regardless of our personal feelings." He nodded, scribbled the information, and turned to leave. At the door he paused. "I was wrong. About you. About everything." "Yes, you were." "You're happy? Truly?" Clara thought of Nathaniel upstairs, probably covered in mashed carrots from feeding Thomas dinner. Thought of Emma's laugh, of the life they were building, of the work that fulfilled her. Happier than I ever imagined possible. Edward left without another word, but 2 days later, a package arrived at the practice. Medical texts from Denver, expensive ones, with a simple note. "For the practice. EC." "Do we accept them?" Clara asked Nathaniel. "Knowledge isn't tainted by its source," he said pragmatically. "Besides, consider it a very small payment for a very large lesson he learned." As spring arrived in Riverbend, bringing with it the usual challenges of frontier life, flooding from snowmelt, injuries from farming accidents, the occasional gunshot wound from saloon disagreements, Clara realized she'd stopped thinking of herself as the woman who'd been rejected at the train station. That humiliation, which had seemed world-ending at the time, had become merely the prologue to her actual story. She was Dr. Ward's wife, yes, but also his partner. She was mother to 2 thriving children who would never remember a time when Nathaniel wasn't their father. She was a healer in her own right, studying medical texts by lamplight, corresponding with other practitioners, slowly working toward the formal education she hoped to pursue when the children were older. The practice expanded. They hired 2 nurses and established a proper hospital ward in the adjoining building. Clara pioneered prenatal care programs that dramatically reduced infant mortality in the region. Nathaniel developed new treatments for the respiratory ailments common in the harsh climate. Together, they built something that mattered. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the twins play in the yard, toddlers now, walking and babbling and getting into everything, Nathaniel said, I received a letter from Chicago today. Clara tensed. They'd built such happiness here, she couldn't bear the thought of it changing. The hospital where I trained offered me a position, chief of medicine, very prestigious, very lucrative. Oh. Clara's voice came out small. I turned it down, of course. She looked at him in surprise. Without discussing it with me? What's to discuss? Our life is here. Our work is here. Our family is here. He took her hand. Clara, I spent years in Chicago trying to outrun grief, and all I did was become someone I didn't recognize. Here, with you and the children, I remembered who I wanted to be. Why would I give that up for prestige? Some would say you're wasting your talents in a frontier town. And I'd say I'm using them exactly where they're needed most. He pulled her closer. Besides, we haven't finished what we started. The hospital expansion, the nursing school you want to establish, watching Thomas and Emma grow up, perhaps giving them siblings. Clara blushed. They'd been careful so far, letting their physical relationship develop slowly, but lately, the prospect of more children they would create together, had begun to seem less frightening and more hopeful. I wouldn't be opposed to that, she said softly. No? No? In fact, she whispered something in his ear that made him laugh and pull her onto his lap. Propriety be damned. Mrs. Ward, you continue to surprise me. Good. I'd hate to become predictable. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. The desperate widow who'd stepped off that train would barely recognize the woman she'd become. That Clara had been running from loss, grasping for security, willing to settle for tolerance disguised as love. This Clara, Dr. Ward's partner, Nathaniel's wife, Thomas, and Emma's mother, Riverbend's respected healer, she wasn't running from anything. She was building toward something, with a man who saw her not as a solution to his loneliness, but as a complete person worthy of partnership and passion. Edward Collins had done her the greatest favor of her life by rejecting her at that train station, though neither of them could have known it at the time. His cruelty had freed her to find something real, not a business arrangement masquerading as marriage, but a true partnership born of mutual respect, shared purpose, and unexpected love. Martha Grant, ever the voice of wisdom, said it best when she visited for Sunday dinner, watching Clara and Nathaniel work together in the kitchen while the twins played at their feet. You know, she said, I've seen a lot of marriages in my time. The ones that last aren't the ones that start with grand passion or perfect circumstances. They're the ones where two people choose to build something together, brick by brick, day by day. You two have built something solid here. And they had. Not just a marriage or a medical practice or a family, but a life, complicated and challenging and occasionally exhausting, but theirs. Completely, wonderfully theirs. As Clara tucked the twins into bed that night, telling them the story of the three bears, with Thomas insisting on roaring for the Papa Bear parts, she heard Nathaniel's footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, watching them with an expression of such contentment that Clara's heart swelled. And they all lived happily ever after, she finished, kissing each child goodnight. Ever after is a long time, Nathaniel said softly as they left the nursery. Yes, Clara agreed, taking his hand. Isn't it wonderful? He pulled her close in the hallway, kissing her with the passion that had been growing between them, no longer careful or hesitant, but full of promise for all the years ahead. I love you, Clara Ward, he murmured against her lips. And I love you, Nathaniel Ward, she replied. Thank you for taking a chance on the desperate woman at the train station. Thank you for being brave enough to stay and fight for the life you deserved. Through their bedroom window, Clara could see the lights of Riverbend spreading out below. Their town now, the place where they'd carved out a future from the ashes of their pasts. Somewhere out there, Edward Collins was probably alone in his grand house, surrounding himself with things instead of people, pride instead of love. She felt a moment of pity for him, then let it go. He'd made his choices, just as she'd made hers. And as Nathaniel drew her into their room, into their bed, into the warm circle of his arms, Clara knew with bone-deep certainty that she'd chosen right. Not the easy path or the expected path, but the right one. The path that led through humiliation to triumph, through desperation to purpose, through loneliness to love. The woman who'd stood on that frozen platform, clutching her babies and her shattered dreams, couldn't have imagined this ending. But then again, Clara thought as Nathaniel whispered her name like a prayer, the best endings are always the ones we never see coming, the ones we have to fight for, build toward, and choose every single day. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the ward house, all was warmth and light, and the quiet, perfect promise of tomorrow. The following spring brought unexpected challenges that would test the foundation Clara and Nathaniel had built together. The morning started ordinarily enough, with Clara preparing medicines in the dispensary while Nathaniel reviewed patient files. The twins, now walking confidently and chattering in their own language, played with wooden blocks Martha had carved for their first birthday. Then the door burst open, bringing with it not just the April wind, but chaos in the form of a bleeding man supported by two cowboys. "Doc, we need help," one of them shouted, and Clara immediately recognized the injured man as Jake Morrison, the judge's son who'd developed a reputation for gambling and fighting. "Get him on the table," Nathaniel ordered, already rolling up his sleeves. Clara moved without thinking, gathering instruments and preparing bandages. The wound was severe. A knife had caught Jake just below the ribs, and blood was pooling dangerously fast. "Clara, I need you to maintain pressure while I prepare for surgery," Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the urgency. She pressed her hands against the wound, feeling the warm blood seep through her fingers while Nathaniel prepared chloroform. "Is he going to make it?" one of the cowboys asked. "Not if you keep distracting us," Clara said sharply. "Wait outside." They worked for 2 hours, Nathaniel's skilled hands suturing internal damage, while Clara managed the anesthesia and monitored Jake's breathing. It was delicate work, the kind that reminded her why Nathaniel had been sought after in Chicago. When they finally stepped back, exhausted but successful, Jake was stable. Judge Morrison arrived as they were cleaning up, his face gray with worry. "How is my boy?" "Alive," Nathaniel said. "He'll recover if infection doesn't set in." He was lucky. Another inch, and the blade would have hit vital organs. The judge sagged with relief, then his expression hardened. This was Edward Collins' doing. Clara's hand stilled on the instruments she was cleaning. What? Jake owed him money, gambling debts. Collins has been using strong-arm tactics to collect lately, hiring thugs from Denver. The judge's jaw clenched. But attacking my son? That's a step too far. Over the following days, as Jake recovered under their care, the story emerged in pieces. Edward's business had been struggling. Competition from newer merchants who didn't alienate half their customers, combined with poor investments in mining ventures that hadn't panned out. He turned to less legitimate means of making money, including high-interest loans to desperate gamblers and farmers. He's become dangerous, Martha told Clara during one of her visits. People are afraid of him now, but not in the respectful way. In the way folks fear a rabid dog. Clara thought of the man who'd humiliated her at the train station, how his cruelty had seemed born of arrogance rather than desperation. Desperate men do desperate things. That they do. You and Nathaniel be careful. He blames you for his troubles, you know, says if you hadn't turned the town against him, his business would still be thriving. Clara wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Edward had turned the town against himself with his behavior, but Martha's concern was genuine, and as it turned out, justified. The attack came on a Tuesday evening. Clara was alone in the office, Nathaniel having gone on a house call to the Brennan farm, where their eldest was in labor. The twins were upstairs with Sally Patterson, the girl they'd hired to help with childcare. She heard the door open and called out without looking up from the patient records she was updating. "I'll be right with you." "Take your time, Mrs. Ward. We have all evening." Clara's blood chilled at Edward Collins' voice. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway with two rough-looking men she didn't recognize. The smell of whiskey wafted from them like a cloud. "Mr. Collins, we're closed for the evening unless this is a medical emergency." "Oh, it's an emergency, all right." He moved into the room, his companions flanking him. "A financial emergency. You see, your husband cost me significant business when he so publicly took my side against me. I think compensation is in order." Clara stood slowly, her hand moving casually toward the drawer where they kept a loaded pistol. Nathaniel had insisted on it after treating too many victims of frontier violence. Whatever quarrel you have with my husband, it can wait until he returns. But that wouldn't be nearly as effective, would it? Edward's smile was ugly. No, I think taking what he values most would send a better message. Before Clara could reach the drawer, one of the men grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. She cried out in pain and heard footsteps on the stairs, Sally coming to investigate. "No!" Clara shouted. "Sally, lock the door and protect the children." She heard the door slam upstairs and the scrape of furniture being moved. Smart girl, barricading themselves in. At least the twins would be safe. "Touching," Edward said. "The devoted mother." "Tell me, does your husband know what a little whore you really are? Coming to town to sell yourself to the highest bidder?" "I came here for an arranged marriage that you agreed to," Clara said through gritted teeth. "Any deception was yours." Edward's face darkened, and he nodded to the man holding her. The thug's grip tightened painfully, and Clara bit back another cry. "You poisoned this town against me," Edward snarled. "Everything was fine until you arrived with your sob story and your bastard children." "Everything was fine because people were too afraid to stand up to you," Clara shot back, anger overcoming fear. "But you showed your true nature at that train station, and people finally saw you for what you are, a petty, cruel man who gets pleasure from others' misfortune." The slap came without warning, Edward's hand cracking across her face hard enough to split her lip. Clara tasted blood but refused to give him the satisfaction of cowering. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said. "Now you'll serve as an example of what happens to those who cross me." But before he could say more, the door crashed open. Not Nathaniel, as Clara had hoped, but Captain Brooks, the retired cavalry officer. Despite his age, he moved with military precision, a rifle aimed steadily at Edward's head. "Release Mrs. Ward immediately," he commanded in a voice that had once ordered charges across battlefields. "This isn't your concern, old man," one of the thugs said, reaching for his gun. The captain's rifle shifted slightly and fired, the bullet catching the man's gun hand. He screamed, dropping the weapon and clutching his bleeding fingers. "The next one goes between someone's eyes," Brooks said calmly. "I've killed better men than you for worse reasons. Mrs. Ward, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Clara said, though her arm throbbed where the thug had twisted it. "Good. Collins, you and your hired scum have 30 seconds to leave this building. After that, I start shooting to kill, and given my service record, no jury in the territory would convict me." Edward's face was purple with rage, but he wasn't stupid enough to test a veteran who'd survived Indian wars and held his rifle like an extension of his body. "This isn't over," he spat at Clara. "Yes, it is," Sheriff McKenna said from the doorway, having arrived with 2 deputies. "Edward Collins, you're under arrest for assault, attempted extortion, and conspiracy to commit violence. Boys, take him." As the deputies hauled Edward and his accomplices away, Clara sank into a chair, shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. Captain Brooks set down his rifle and gently examined her split lip. "That'll need attention," he said. "Where's Nathaniel?" "The Brennan farm. Their daughter's having a baby. I'll send someone to fetch him. You shouldn't be alone." "Captain," Clara said, catching his sleeve, "how did you know to come?" The old soldier smiled. "Sally Patterson's a smart girl. Saw the thugs through the window and climbed out the back with your little ones, ran straight to my house, said you were in trouble. I grabbed my rifle and came running, sent her to the sheriff." Clara's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you." "Don't mention it. You and the doc have done right by this town. About time the town did right by you." Nathaniel arrived within the hour, having ridden hard from the Brennan farm. He burst through the door wild-eyed, only relaxing when he saw Clara relatively unharmed. "I'm all right," she said quickly as he gathered her into his arms. "Your lip says otherwise." His fingers ghosted over the cut, and she saw murder in his eyes. "I'll kill him." "No need," Captain Brooks said. "He's in jail where he belongs. Judge Morrison's particularly interested in having a word with him about his son's stabbing." Nathaniel held Clara tighter, and she could feel him trembling, not with fear, but with rage. "He could have killed you." "But he didn't. And now he's finished in Riverbend. No one will protect him after this." The trial was swift. With Clara's testimony, Captain Brooks' witness account, and the judge's personal interest in seeing justice done for his son, Edward Collins, was sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison. Vivian Collins, faced with the shame of her brother's crimes and the loss of their business to pay his debts, left Riverbend for San Francisco, where she had distant relatives. The Collins house and store were put up for auction. In an ironic twist that Clara couldn't help but appreciate, Martha Grant purchased the store with money she'd saved over the years, turning it into a cooperative where local farmers could sell their goods directly, cutting out the predatory middlemen who'd taken advantage of them for years. "Seems fitting," Martha said when she showed Clara the deed. "That building saw your humiliation. Now it'll see your triumph. I'm naming you and Nathaniel as medical consultants for the co-op. Free clinics once a month for members. But the real triumph came in smaller moments, the way the town rallied around them after the attack, with families bringing food and offering support. The way Thomas and Emma remained blissfully unaware of the danger they'd been in, their innocence preserved by Sally's quick thinking. The way Nathaniel held Clara each night, as if reassuring himself that she was still there, still safe. "I could have lost you," he said one evening as they lay in bed, his fingers tracing the fading bruise on her arm. "But you didn't," Clara reminded him. "We're stronger than Edward Collins. We're stronger than anyone who tries to tear us down." He kissed her then, deeply and desperately, and that night they made love with an intensity born of near loss and renewed gratitude. When Clara discovered a month later that she was pregnant, it felt like a final victory over the forces that had tried to destroy them. "A baby," Nathaniel said wonderingly when she told him, his hand spreading across her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, suddenly uncertain. They'd talked about children, but talking and reality were different things. "Happy?" He laughed, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around the kitchen, making her squeal. "Clara, I'm ecstatic. Thomas and Emma will have a sibling. Our family is growing. The practice is growing too," Clara pointed out. "We'll need more help. Then we'll hire more help. Clara, we're building something here. Not just a family or a practice, but a legacy. Our children will grow up knowing their parents made a difference, that we stood for something." He was right. Over the following months, as Clara's pregnancy progressed and the practice continued to expand, she could see the legacy taking shape. They established a proper nursing school, bringing in qualified instructors from Denver. They pioneered new treatments for mining injuries, publishing papers that were read in medical schools back east. They turned Riverbend from a frontier town with minimal medical care into a regional center for healing. The baby arrived during a November blizzard, as if making a dramatic entrance was a family tradition. Clara's labor was long and difficult, and for the first time she truly understood the fear her patients' husbands displayed when they paced outside during deliveries. Nathaniel, despite having delivered dozens of babies, was nearly useless with anxiety when it came to his own wife. Martha finally banished him from the room. "You're making everyone nervous," she said firmly. "Go tend to your other children and let us women handle this." But when their daughter finally arrived, healthy, loud, and perfect, Nathaniel was there to place her in Clara's arms. "She's beautiful," he whispered, touching the baby's downy dark hair. "What should we name her?" "Hope," Clara said without hesitation, "because that's what she represents. Hope for our future, for our family, for everything we're building." Thomas and Emma were fascinated by their new sister, though Thomas was somewhat disappointed she couldn't immediately play with his toy soldiers. Sally, who'd become like family after her heroic actions during Edward's attack, helped manage the chaos of 3 children while Clara recovered. The christening was held on a clear December day, with half the town in attendance. Judge Morrison stood as godfather. He'd become a close friend after the trials that had brought them together, and Martha, of course, was godmother. "Look at you," Martha said quietly to Clara as they watched Nathaniel hold Hope up for the blessing. "That desperate woman at the train station would never recognize you now." "I barely recognize her myself," Clara admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "It was, in a way. You've lived more in 2 years than some folks do in 20. As the minister spoke words of blessing over Hope, Clara looked around the church. These people who'd once whispered about her, who'd witnessed her humiliation, now celebrated with her. She'd earned their respect not through marriage to Nathaniel, though that had helped, but through her own actions, her competence, her refusal to be broken by circumstances. That evening, as snow began to fall outside their windows, the Ward family gathered in their parlor. Nathaniel read to Thomas and Emma from a picture book while Clara nursed Hope. It was a scene of such domestic tranquility that Clara wanted to capture it somehow, hold it forever. "What are you thinking?" Nathaniel asked, looking up from the book. "How different this is from what I expected when I answered that advertisement," Clara said. "I thought I was trading myself for security, accepting a business arrangement disguised as marriage. Instead, I found—" "What did you find?" "Everything," she said simply. "Love, purpose, family, respect. Everything I never dared dream of." Nathaniel set aside the book and came to sit beside her, careful not to disturb Hope's feeding. "You didn't find it, Clara. You built it. We built it. Every choice you made, from standing up to Edward that first day to staying and fighting for your place here, you created this life." "We created it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Nor I without you. I was merely existing before you arrived, going through the motions of living without actually being alive." Emma climbed into his lap, and Thomas leaned against Clara's side, their little family complete and content. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, all was warmth and love. A year passed, then 2, then 5. The Ward children grew strong and smart, educated not just in books but in compassion, watching their parents treat rich and poor with equal dignity. The practice became a full hospital, the first in the region with surgical facilities that rivaled those in Denver. Clara completed correspondence courses in medicine, and while she couldn't receive an official degree, women weren't yet admitted to most medical schools, she became known as Doc Clara to everyone in town, her skills recognized if not formally certified. Edward Collins died in prison during his 3rd year, killed in a fight with another inmate. Clara felt no satisfaction at the news, only a distant pity for a man whose pride and cruelty had cost him everything. Vivian never returned to Riverbend, though rumors occasionally drifted back about her unsuccessful attempts to reclaim her former social standing in San Francisco. The town itself grew and prospered. The railroad extended a line through Riverbend, bringing new settlers and opportunities. Martha's Cooperative became a model for similar ventures throughout the territory. The nursing school Clara had helped establish produced graduates who spread throughout the West, carrying with them the principles of compassion and competence she'd insisted upon. On a spring day in 1885, 7 years after Clara had stepped off that train, she stood in the same depot, now expanded and modernized. But this time, she wasn't arriving in desperation. She was seeing off their first nursing school graduates, young women heading to positions in hospitals from California to Texas. "I'm proud of you," Nathaniel said, standing beside her as the train pulled away. "This is your vision made real." "Our vision?" Claire corrected, as she always did. "None of this would exist without your support, your belief that women could be more than assistants in medicine. I believed it because I saw it every day in you." Thomas, now 8 and determined to be a doctor like his parents, tugged at Clara's skirt. "Mama, when can I start helping in the hospital?" "When you're older and can reach the supply shelves," Clara said, ruffling his hair. "I can reach them if I use a stool." "No stools in the surgery," Nathaniel said firmly, though his eyes twinkled. "But you can help your mother organize the medicine cabinet this afternoon if you promise to be careful." Emma, quieter than her brother but equally determined, was already reading medical texts at 7, her quick mind absorbing information like a sponge. Hope, now 5, showed more interest in the business side of the practice, often helping with the accounting by drawing pictures on the margins of the ledgers. "We've created a medical dynasty," Clara joked to Martha one day as they watched the children play doctor with their dolls. "You've created something better," Martha replied. "You've shown them that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choice. Every day, you and Nathaniel choose each other, choose these children, choose this life. That's the lesson that matters." She was right, Clara realized. Every morning when she woke beside Nathaniel, every patient they treated together, every meal shared with their children, these were choices, deliberate and meaningful. They hadn't fallen into this life by accident or accepted it by default. They'd built it, brick by brick, choice by choice. The 10th anniversary of Clara's arrival in Riverbend was marked by an unexpected event. The town council, led by Judge Morrison, voted to rename the hospital the Ward Medical Center and presented Clara with an honorary medical degree from the Territorial Medical Board, not legally binding perhaps, but a recognition of her decade of service. "This doesn't make me a real doctor," Clara protested to Nathaniel that evening, staring at the framed certificate. "You've been a real doctor for years," he said. "This just makes it official in the eyes of those who needed paper to see what was already true." That night, as had become their tradition on important anniversaries, they walked to the train depot. It had been Nathaniel's idea originally, to face the place of Clara's humiliation and reclaim it as something else. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Edward had accepted you that day?" Nathaniel asked as they stood on the platform, now lit by electric lights instead of oil lamps. "Never," Clara said firmly. "That woman, the one who got off the train, she was running from something, not toward it. She would have accepted a loveless marriage and been grateful for it. She would have raised her children to be quiet and compliant. She would have disappeared into Edward Collins' shadow and never discovered what she was capable of." "And what are you capable of?" Clara looked at this man who'd given her not just his name, but his partnership, his respect, his love. Who'd taken her children as his own without hesitation. Who'd fought for her place in a world that didn't easily make room for women with ambition. "Everything," she said. "With you, I'm capable of everything." He kissed her there on the platform where her old life had ended and her real life had begun. Where humiliation had transformed into opportunity. Where a desperate widow with 2 infants and $3 had become a healer, a teacher, a mother, a wife, not in the subservient sense Edward had imagined, but as an equal partner in a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine love. "I love you, Clara Ward," Nathaniel said against her lips. "And I love you, Nathaniel Ward," she replied. "Thank you for seeing who I could be before I saw it myself. You always had it in you. You just needed the chance to let it flourish." As they walked home, hand in hand through streets they'd helped heal, past businesses they'd helped save, toward children they'd raised with love and purpose, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Every hardship had been worth it. Edward's cruelty, the town's initial judgment, the struggles to establish credibility, the threats to their safety, because each challenge had only made them stronger. The Ward Medical Center stood as a testament to what 2 people could build when they refused to accept limitations, when they chose to see possibility where others saw scandal, when they decided that love was not a luxury, but a necessity, not a weakness, but a strength. And in the end, Clara thought, as Nathaniel opened their front door to reveal their children waiting eagerly for their nightly story, that was the greatest triumph of all, not just surviving the rejection at the train station, but transforming it into the foundation of something extraordinary. The woman who'd clutched her babies on that freezing platform, devastated by Edward Collins' public rejection, could never have imagined this life. But then again, Clara had learned that the best revenges weren't acts of retaliation, but of transformation. Edward had wanted to break her. Instead, he'd freed her. He'd wanted to humiliate her. Instead, he'd given her the opportunity to discover her own strength. He'd wanted to destroy her future. Instead, he'd cleared the path for a better one than she'd ever dared imagine. As she tucked her children into bed that night, all 3 of them in the nursery they still insisted on sharing despite having their own rooms, Clara told them a story she'd never told before. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a woman who thought she needed a prince to save her." "Like in the fairy tales?" Emma asked. "Exactly like in the fairy tales. But when she went to meet her prince, he turned out to be not a prince at all, but a troll in disguise." "Trolls are mean," Thomas declared. "This one certainly was." He sent her away into the cold, dark forest with her 2 precious treasures. "What treasures?" Hope asked, already sleepy. "The most valuable treasures in the world, her children." And as she wandered in the forest, cold and afraid, she met a woodcutter. "Was he handsome?" Emma wanted to know. "He was kind," Clara said, glancing at Nathaniel listening from the doorway. "And kindness, it turns out, is much more important than being a prince." The woodcutter didn't save the woman. Instead, he gave her an axe and taught her to cut her own path through the forest. "Did they fight the troll?" Thomas asked hopefully. "They didn't need to." The troll destroyed himself with his own meanness. And the woman and the woodcutter built a beautiful home in the forest, where they healed sick animals and helped lost travelers and raised their treasures to be brave and kind and strong. Did they live happily ever after? Hope murmured, almost asleep. They lived happily, Clara said, kissing each child's forehead. Ever after is still being written. Later, as she and Nathaniel prepared for bed, he said, I liked your story, though I'm not sure I appreciate being called a woodcutter. Would you prefer Prince Charming? God, no. Prince Charming would have swept you away from your troubles. The woodcutter gave you the tools to solve them yourself. I'd rather be the woodcutter any day. Good, Clara said, moving into his arms, because I never needed a prince. I needed a partner. I needed you. They made love that night with the familiar passion that hadn't dimmed over the years, but had instead deepened, enhanced by trust and knowledge and shared experience. And afterward, as they lay entwined, Nathaniel said something that surprised her. I want to tell you something I've never told anyone. About Chicago. About my family. Clara stayed quiet, knowing how rarely he spoke of that time. My wife, Margaret. I loved her, but it was a quiet love. Expected. We married because it made sense, because our families approved, because it was what was done. When she died, I grieved, but I also felt guilty. Because part of what I grieved was the chance to ever have what we never quite achieved. Real partnership, real passion. He paused, gathering his thoughts. With you, Clara, I have what I didn't even know I was looking for. You challenge me, inspire me, make me want to be better than I am. My love for you isn't quiet or expected. It's fierce and choice-driven and renewed every day. Margaret gave me contentment. You gave me life. Clara kissed him, tasting salt and realizing she was crying. We gave each other life. That's what partners do. As sleep finally claimed them, wrapped in each other's arms in the bed they'd shared for a decade, in the home they'd built together, in the town they'd helped transform, Clara's last thought was one of profound gratitude. Not to Edward Collins, he deserved no thanks for his cruelty, but to the universe, fate, God, whatever force had brought her to that train platform on that terrible, wonderful day. Because sometimes, Clara had learned, the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways. Sometimes rejection is redirection. Sometimes humiliation is liberation. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, the end of one story is actually the beginning of a much better one. The woman who'd stepped off that train in desperation had been reborn through fire and struggle into someone stronger, someone worthier, someone complete. And as Clara Ward drifted off to sleep beside the man who'd seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself, she smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patience, new possibilities. The story that had begun with rejection on a frozen platform had become something else entirely, a testament to resilience, a celebration of partnership, a love story not of rescue, but of mutual salvation. And it was far from over. The seasons turned, bringing with them new challenges and unexpected trials that would test the Ward family in ways they hadn't anticipated. It was a humid July morning when the telegram arrived that would shake the foundation of everything they'd built. Clara was teaching a class of nursing students when Sally burst in, her face pale with urgency. Mrs. Ward, you need to come quickly. There's been word from Chicago. Clara's heart immediately clenched. Nathaniel had gone to Chicago 2 weeks earlier for a medical conference, his first trip back to the city since he'd fled westward all those years ago. He'd been reluctant to go, but a breakthrough in surgical techniques for treating mining injuries had garnered attention from the medical establishment, and they'd requested his presence to demonstrate the procedure. What's happened? Claire asked, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Sally handed her the telegram with trembling fingers. Clara read it once, then again, unable to process the words. Dr. Ward critically injured in carriage accident. Condition grave. Come immediately. Chicago Presbyterian Hospital. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white, as her students looked on in concern. She couldn't fall apart, not here, not now. There was too much to do. Class is dismissed, she managed to say. Sally, please fetch Captain Brooks and ask him to watch the children. Send word to Dr. Patterson in Millbrook that he'll need to cover our emergencies. I'll need tickets on the next train to Chicago. Mrs. Ward, one of her students, Mary, stepped forward. Let us help. We can manage the hospital while you're gone. Clara looked at these young women she'd trained, seeing in them the same determination that had driven her to fight for her place in medicine. The town is counting on this hospital. Can you handle it? You taught us well, Mary said firmly. Go to him. We'll hold things together here. Within hours, Clara was on a train heading east, the landscape blurring past windows she didn't see. All she could think about was Nathaniel lying broken in a hospital bed, possibly dying, certainly suffering, and her not there beside him. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now the one making a desperate train journey toward an uncertain future, though this time it was love, not survival, that drove her forward. The journey took 3 days, each one an agony of uncertainty. At every station, she sent telegrams requesting updates, but the responses were vague, holding stable, no change, still critical. She barely slept, barely ate, sustained only by determination and the prayers she whispered into the darkness. Chicago Presbyterian Hospital was a massive brick building that seemed to loom against the sky like a monument to human suffering and healing. Claire had barely announced herself at the reception desk before a doctor appeared, older, distinguished, with kind eyes behind wire spectacles. Mrs. Ward? I'm Dr. Morrison. I've been treating your husband. How is he? What happened? Can I see him? Dr. Morrison took her arm gently, leading her down a corridor that smelled of carbolic and despair. There was an accident. A brewery wagon lost control and crashed into his carriage. Your husband was thrown clear but suffered severe injuries. We've managed to stabilize him, but... Clara's voice was barely a whisper. He's been unconscious for 5 days. There's swelling in the brain, multiple broken bones, internal injuries we're still assessing. Mrs. Ward, I need you to prepare yourself. Even if he survives, he may not be the man you knew. Clara stopped walking, turning to face the doctor fully. Dr. Morrison, I've assisted in hundreds of procedures. I've seen men rebuilt from near death. Please don't cushion the truth. I need to know exactly what we're facing. Something in her tone must have convinced him, because his expression shifted from sympathetic to professional. Fractured skull with significant cerebral edema. 4 broken ribs, one of which punctured his lung. We've repaired that. Fractured left femur and right clavicle. Possible spinal damage, though we won't know the extent until he wakes. If he wakes. He'll wake, Clara said with more confidence than she felt. Take me to him. Nothing could have prepared her for the sight of Nathaniel in that hospital bed. His strong, capable body looked diminished, broken. Bandages covered half his head, his left leg was in traction, and his chest rose and fell with labored, uneven breaths. But he was alive, and that was enough to start with. Clara pulled a chair beside his bed, took his uninjured hand in both of hers, and began to talk. Nathaniel Ward, you listen to me. You don't get to leave us. Not now. Not like this. Thomas has been working on a surprise for you. He's been secretly reading your medical journals and wants to present a case study when you return. Emma's been teaching Hope to play chess using the set you carved for her. They need their father. She talked until her voice grew hoarse, telling him about the hospital, the children, the town that was praying for his recovery. She talked about their life together, the memories they'd made, the future they'd planned. And when words failed, she simply held his hand and willed him to feel her presence, to know he wasn't alone. Days blurred together in that sterile room, Clara established a routine, checking his vitals, adjusting his position to prevent bed sores, massaging his limbs to maintain circulation. The hospital staff initially resisted her involvement, but when they saw her competence, they gradually accepted her as part of Nathaniel's care team. Dr. Morrison became an unexpected ally. Your husband spoke of you during the conference, he told her one evening. Said you were the finest medical mind he'd ever encountered, degree or no degree. Seeing you work, I understand why. He always had more faith in me than I had in myself, Claire said, not taking her eyes off Nathaniel's still form. Perhaps, or perhaps he simply saw clearly what others missed. On the 10th day, as Clara was performing her morning examination, she felt it, the slightest pressure from Nathaniel's hand squeezing hers. Her heart leaped. "Nathaniel? Can you hear me? Squeeze my hand again if you can hear me." Another squeeze, stronger this time. His eyelids fluttered and then, miraculously, opened. His gray eyes were unfocused, confused, but they were looking at her. "Clara?" His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "I'm here," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm right here, my love. The children are safe and well and waiting for you to come home." She pressed his hand to her cheek. "Don't try to talk. Rest. You're going to be fine." But fine was a relative term, she soon learned. Nathaniel's recovery was agonizingly slow. The swelling in his brain receded, but it left him with splitting headaches and occasional confusion. His bones would heal, but the spinal injury was more concerning. He had limited feeling in his left leg, and walking even a few steps exhausted him. "I'm useless," he said bitterly one afternoon after a particularly difficult therapy session. "I can't practice medicine like this. I can't be a husband, a father." "Stop," Clara said sharply. "You're alive, and that's what matters. Everything else we can work with. Clara, be realistic. I may never fully recover. You could be tied to an invalid for the rest of your life." She moved to sit on his bed, carefully avoiding his injuries, and took his face in her hands. "Nathaniel Ward, I stood on a train platform once with everything I owned in one bag and 2 infants in my arms. And you took a chance on me when no one else would. You gave me purpose, partnership, love. Did you really think I would abandon you the moment you needed me? I wouldn't blame you if you did." "Then you're not as smart as I thought," Clara said. "We're partners, remember? In sickness and in health. Besides, you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" "I'm very good at rebuilding broken things. And you, my dear husband, are going to be my masterpiece." She developed a rehabilitation program that the Chicago doctors initially called aggressive, but gradually came to admire as Nathaniel's improvement outpaced their expectations. She pushed him physically, but carefully, knowing exactly how far she could challenge him without causing damage. She engaged his mind with medical discussions, having him consult on cases from his bed, reminding him that his intellect remained undiminished. Letters from home arrived regularly. Martha wrote with updates about the town. Captain Brooks sent military-style reports on the children's activities, and the nursing students provided detailed accounts of cases they'd handled. Most touching were the letters from the children themselves, Thomas's careful printing describing his daily adventures, Emma's neat cursive filled with observations about the world around her, and Hope's drawings with Sally's transcribed messages. "They need you to come home, Papa," Sally had written for Hope. "But Mama needs you more, so stay until you're both ready." "Wise child," Nathaniel said, tracing the crayon flowers Hope had drawn around the edges of the paper. 6 weeks after the accident, Nathaniel took his first unassisted steps across the hospital room. It was only 4 steps, and he was sweating and shaking by the end, but it was a victory. Dr. Morrison, who'd become a friend through the ordeal, actually applauded. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted to Clara privately. "His recovery is remarkable. Whatever you're doing, it's working." "I'm reminding him who he is," Clara said simply. "Not just a patient, but a doctor, a father, a man with work still to do." But the real test came when Dr. Morrison suggested Nathaniel could benefit from an experimental surgery being pioneered in Vienna for spinal injuries. The procedure was risky, with no guarantee of success, and would require months more away from home. "We should consider it," Nathaniel said that evening. "Should we?" Clara asked carefully. "If there's a chance I could fully recover, practice medicine properly again." "You can practice medicine now, differently than before perhaps, but your mind is intact, your hands are steady. The question isn't whether you could benefit from the surgery, but whether the risk is worth it." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "What would you do?" "I would go home," Clara said without hesitation. "I would go home to our children who haven't seen us in 2 months. I would adapt my practice to accommodate my limitations. I would live the life I have instead of risking it for the life I think I should have. Even if it means I'm never the man I was." "You're already not the man you were. You're stronger because you've survived something that should have killed you. You're braver because you're facing limitations with grace, and you're loved completely and unconditionally, exactly as you are. Nathaniel reached for her hand, his grip strong despite everything. Take me home, Clara. The journey back to Riverbend was vastly different from Clara's desperate flight to Chicago. They traveled in a specially arranged car with a bed for Nathaniel, though he insisted on sitting up for portions of the journey, eager to see the landscape that led toward home. Clara watched the tension leave his shoulders as they moved further west, as if each mile away from Chicago lifted a weight from his spirit. When they finally arrived at Riverbend Station, it seemed the entire town had turned out to welcome them home. Nathaniel, leaning heavily on a cane but standing on his own feet, was overwhelmed by the reception. "Did you arrange this?" he asked Clara. "I didn't have to. These people love you, Nathaniel. You've saved their lives, delivered their children, been there in their darkest moments. They wanted to be here for yours." Thomas, Emma, and Hope broke free from Martha's hold and ran toward them. Clara knelt to catch them, but they slowed as they approached Nathaniel, suddenly uncertain. He couldn't kneel to embrace them as he once would have, but he opened his arms, and that was enough. They pressed against him carefully, as if understanding his fragility, and he held them as tightly as he could manage. "Papa, you came back," Hope said into his coat. "I promised I would, didn't I?" "Promises are important," Emma said solemnly. "Mama taught us that." "Your mama is the wisest person I know," Nathaniel said, meeting Clara's eyes over the children's heads. The walk from the station to their home was slow, with Nathaniel stopping frequently to rest, but no one seemed to mind. The town moved at his pace, creating a protective circle around their returning doctor. When they finally reached the hospital, Nathaniel stopped, taking in the sight of it. "It's still standing," he said with wonder. "Of course it is," Mary, the nursing student, said. "We followed Mrs. Ward's protocols exactly, though we're very glad to have you both back." Inside, Clara was amazed to find everything running smoothly. The students had not just maintained the hospital, but improved certain systems, showing initiative she hadn't expected. Patient records were meticulously kept, supplies were organized, and the treatment rooms were spotless. "You did well," she told them, "all of you." "We had excellent teachers," Mary replied. Adjusting to their new reality took time. Nathaniel couldn't stand for long surgeries, so Clara took the lead on those while he supervised and instructed. He focused more on diagnostics and treatment plans, using his mind where his body couldn't fully serve. They modified the practice, adding chairs where he could sit while examining patients, restructuring the workspace to minimize the walking required. Some patients initially seemed uncomfortable with a visibly disabled doctor, but Nathaniel's competence quickly overcame their prejudices. If anything, his own struggle with recovery made him more empathetic to his patients' suffering, more understanding of their fears. "You've changed," Clara observed one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the children play in the yard. Nathaniel's cane rested against his chair, a constant reminder of how their lives had altered. "Have I?" "You're more patient, more present. Before the accident, you were always rushing to the next case, the next challenge. Now you take time to really see people." "Nearly dying has a way of clarifying what matters," Nathaniel said. "I spent so many years running from grief, then building walls to prevent more loss. The accident broke down those walls. Made me realize that the only true tragedy would be not fully living whatever time we have." Clara leaned against him carefully, still mindful of his healing injuries. "Do you regret not trying the Vienna surgery?" "No. This," he gestured to their children, their home, their life, "this is worth more than the possibility of perfect recovery. I can work, I can love my family, I can contribute to our community. What more do I need?" As if to prove his point, Thomas approached with a thick notebook. "Papa, I've been keeping observations like you taught me, about the spotted fever outbreak last month. Want to see?" "Absolutely," Nathaniel said, pulling his son close. As Thomas eagerly explained his detailed notes about symptoms and recovery patterns, Clara saw the future taking shape. Their children learning not just medicine, but resilience, adaptation, the power of choosing joy despite circumstances. The town, too, adapted. Ramps appeared at the hospital and other buildings without anyone discussing it, just neighbors quietly making accommodations. The church moved Nathaniel's regular pew to the aisle so he wouldn't have to navigate the narrow rows. Small kindnesses that spoke to the community they'd helped build. One day, about 6 months after their return, Edward Collins' sister Vivian appeared in their doorway. Clara hadn't seen her since she'd left for San Francisco years earlier, and time had not been kind. Her once elegant clothes were worn, her face drawn with hardship. "I need your help," she said without preamble. "I have nowhere else to turn." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. This woman had tormented her, had supported her brother's cruelty. But Nathaniel, seated in his examination chair, spoke first. "What's wrong?" Vivian's composure cracked. "I'm sick. The doctors in San Francisco say it's cancer. They say there's nothing to be done, but I heard you've been developing new treatments." "Some experimental approaches, yes," Nathaniel said carefully, "but I can't promise anything. I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for help. I know I don't deserve it after everything, but—" "Sit down," Claire interrupted. "Let us examine you." Vivian's eyes filled with tears. "After what I did to you?" "What you did was years ago. Today you're a patient who needs care. That's all that matters." They treated Vivian for 3 months, using a combination of traditional and experimental approaches. She lived in Martha's boarding house, the same place that had sheltered Clara in her darkest hour. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but Martha, ever practical, simply said, "A sick woman needs a bed." "I have beds." During her treatment, Vivian gradually unburdened herself to Clara. "I was so angry when you arrived," she admitted one afternoon during her medicine preparation. "Edward had promised that his new wife would solidify our social standing, would help expand the business. When you refused him, it felt like you'd stolen our future." "I didn't refuse him. He rejected me," Clara pointed out. "I know that now. Edward, he twisted things, made himself the victim always. I see that now. Prison didn't reform him. It just made him angrier. When he died, I thought I was free. But I'd built my whole life around his ambitions. Without them, I didn't know who I was. And now—" Vivian smiled weakly. "Now I'm dying, and for the first time I'm seeing clearly. You and Dr. Ward, what you've built here, the family you've created, this is what Edward could never understand. Real success isn't about money or status. It's about connection, purpose, love." She died peacefully 2 weeks later, but not before making amends with many she'd wronged. She left what little money she had to the hospital's charity fund, a final gesture toward redemption. "It's strange," Clara said to Nathaniel after Vivian's funeral. "She and Edward came from the same family, had the same opportunities, but she found grace at the end while he died bitter and alone." "People choose who they become," Nathaniel said. "Every day, in small ways and large, we choose." Edward chose pride and cruelty. Vivian eventually chose humility and kindness. We chose each other. "The best choice I ever made," Clara said, kissing him gently. As 1890 dawned, the Ward family had settled into their new rhythm. Nathaniel had regained more mobility than the Chicago doctors had predicted, though he still relied on his cane and had bad days when the pain kept him in bed. Clara had essentially become the lead physician at the hospital, with Nathaniel serving as senior consultant. Their partnership had evolved but remained strong. Thomas, now 15, was preparing to attend medical school in Denver, his quick mind and careful observation skills marking him as a natural physician. Emma, 14, had surprised everyone by announcing her intention to study law, inspired by the injustices she'd witnessed. "Someone needs to make sure the laws protect people like Mama was," she'd said firmly. Hope, at 12, showed artistic talents, sketching detailed anatomical drawings that aided in teaching new nurses. "Our children are remarkable," Nathaniel said one evening as they watched Thomas teaching Hope the proper way to suture using a piece of fabric. "They've had remarkable examples," Clara replied. "Not just in success, but in facing adversity." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sally, now married to the sheriff's deputy and with children of her own, stood there with a telegram. "This just came from Denver," she said, her expression unreadable. Clara opened it with trembling fingers, then read it twice before handing it to Nathaniel. "The Territorial Medical Board is offering me a position, professor of nursing at the new medical college. Full recognition of my experience retroactive degree, and a salary that's substantial. Clara, this is wonderful, Nathaniel said. This is everything you've worked for. It would mean moving to Denver. Then we moved to Denver. Clara stared at him. Just like that? Leave everything we've built here? What we've built isn't the buildings, Clara. It's us, our family, our knowledge. That goes wherever we go. And think what you could do, training not just a handful of nurses, but hundreds, changing the face of medicine for women across the territory. But your practice can be managed by Dr. Patterson and the excellent staff we've trained. Clara, you've supported my dreams for 15 years. Let me support yours. Clara looked around their home, thought of the town that had become their sanctuary, the people who'd become their family. Then she thought of all the women like her, with skill and passion but no formal recognition, who could benefit from what she'd learned. The children will adapt. Thomas will be in Denver anyway for school. Emma can attend the academy there, get better preparation for law school. Hope will have access to art teachers we could never provide here. And you? Honestly, Nathaniel, will you be happy in Denver? He pulled her into his lap, his arms still strong despite everything. I'm happy wherever you are. Besides, a consulting position at a teaching hospital sounds rather appealing for a doctor who can't stand for 12-hour surgeries anymore. They announced their decision at the next town meeting, and while there was sadness, there was also pride. Riverbend was losing the wards, but gaining the prestige of having produced the territory's first female medical professor. Martha Grant, now in her 70s but still spry, pulled Clara aside. You've come so far from that frightened woman at the train station. Thanks to you. You gave me shelter when I had nothing. I gave you a roof. You built everything else yourself. Martha pressed something into Clara's hand, a worn photograph. I've kept this all these years. Thought you should have it. It was a picture Clara didn't know existed, taken at the Harvest Festival their first year of marriage. She and Nathaniel stood with the children, looking at each other rather than the camera, their faces full of joy and love. But what struck Clara most was how young they looked, how unaware of the challenges ahead, Nathaniel's accident, the struggles for recognition, the long fight for acceptance. We had no idea what was coming, Clara murmured. No one ever does, Martha said. But look at your faces. Even then, you had what mattered, each other. Everything else was just detail. The farewell gathering at the train station was vastly different from Clara's arrival 17 years earlier. This time, she stood surrounded by friends, colleagues, and patients whose lives she'd touched. The platform that had once been the site of her humiliation was now the launching point for her greatest adventure yet. Dr. Patterson and his wife promised to visit. The nursing students presented her with a leather-bound journal inscribed with, "To our teacher and inspiration." Even Judge Morrison, now elderly but still sharp, came to see them off. You transformed this town, he told Clara. When you arrived, we were just another frontier settlement. Now we're known across the territory for our medical facilities, our nursing school, our progressive attitudes. That's your legacy. Our legacy, Clara corrected, taking Nathaniel's arm. As the train whistle blew, Clara helped Nathaniel navigate the steps. He could manage them, but appreciated the support. The children were already aboard, excited about the adventure ahead. She paused at the door, looking back at the platform one last time. The same platform where Edward Collins had rejected her. The same platform where she'd stood with nothing but determination and 2 infants. The same platform where her real life had begun, though she hadn't known it at the time. No regrets? Nathaniel asked softly. Not one, Clara said firmly. Every moment, every struggle, every triumph led us here. How could I regret the path that brought me you? As the train pulled away from Riverbend, Clara didn't look back. She sat beside Nathaniel, their children chattering excitedly about Denver, about the future, about possibilities yet unknown. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of years together. I have something for you, he said, pulling out an envelope. Open it when we get to Denver. What is it? A surprise, is something I've been working on with the medical board. Clara tucked the envelope away, content to wait. She'd learned patience over the years, learned that the best things often came when you weren't desperately grasping for them. The journey to Denver took 2 days, during which the Ward family played cards, told stories, and planned their new life. Thomas sketched designs for medical instruments he wanted to develop. Emma read law texts, occasionally asking Nathaniel complex questions about medical jurisprudence. Hope drew portraits of passengers, capturing their essence with remarkable skill. "We raised interesting children," Nathaniel observed. "We raised children who know they can be whatever they choose to be," Claire replied. "That's the gift we gave them. Not wealth or status, but possibility." Denver sprawled before them, all brick and ambition, reaching toward the mountains like a promise of greatness. Their new house near the medical college was modest but comfortable, with enough room for Nathaniel's study, Claire's library, and the children's various projects. That evening, as they sat in their new parlor with boxes still stacked around them, Clara finally opened Nathaniel's envelope. Inside was an official document from the American Medical Association, recognizing her as a full doctor of medicine, with all rights and privileges thereof, the first woman in the territory to receive such recognition without formal schooling. "How?" she whispered. "I presented your case histories, your innovations, your teaching record. The board in Chicago was particularly impressed by your rehabilitation techniques after my accident. Doctor, Morrison advocated strongly for you. It's retroactive to 1880, acknowledging all the years you've practiced." "Nathaniel." "Dr. Ward," he said with a grin. "I believe I should call you Dr. Ward now." Clara laughed through her tears. "We're both Dr. Ward." "The Doctor's Ward of Denver has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" That night, as they christened their new bedroom in the time-honored way of married couples, Clara marveled at the journey that had brought them here. The frightened widow at the train station could never have imagined becoming a professor, a recognized doctor, a pioneer for women in medicine. But then, she couldn't have imagined Nathaniel either, not the polished doctor he'd been, but the complex, wounded, brilliant man who'd chosen to build a life with her. "I love you," she said against his shoulder afterward, their bodies still intertwined despite the careful choreography required by his injuries. "Still?" he teased. "After all these years?" "More," she said seriously. "Every year, more. You gave me the space to become who I was meant to be. You did the same for me. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions of life. You brought me back to the living." They were quiet for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of their new city outside the window. Then Nathaniel spoke again. "Do you ever think about him? Edward Collins?" Clara considered the question. "Sometimes, but not with anger anymore. His cruelty freed me to find something real. If he'd accepted me that day, I'd have lived a small, constrained life, never knowing what I was capable of. His rejection was the greatest gift he could have given me, though he never knew it." "His loss," Nathaniel said, pulling her closer. "My infinite gain." As sleep claimed them in their new home, in their new city, at the start of their new adventure, Clara thought about the woman she'd become. Not despite that humiliation at the train station, but because of it. Every rejection had redirected her towards something better. Every obstacle had revealed strength she didn't know she possessed. Every loss had made room for unexpected gifts. Tomorrow she would begin teaching, sharing her hard-won knowledge with a new generation of healers. Tomorrow, Nathaniel would start his consulting position, his brilliant mind unmarred by physical limitations. Tomorrow, their children would continue growing toward their own dreams, supported by parents who understood that love wasn't possession, but partnership. But tonight, Clara simply held her husband in the darkness, grateful for the journey that had brought them here, grateful for the courage to keep going when everything seemed lost, grateful for the love that had grown from the ashes of disaster. The train platform in Riverbend remained, would always remain, the place where Clara Hayes had died and Clara Ward had been born. Not through marriage alone, but through choosing to fight, to grow, to become. Edward Collins had wanted a decoration for his life. Instead, his rejection had created a force of nature, a woman who would change the face of medicine in the territory, who would open doors for countless others, who would prove that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the beginning of everything extraordinary. The Denver years brought challenges neither Clara nor Nathaniel had anticipated. Their first winter in the city, Hope fell dangerously ill with pneumonia, and for 10 terrifying days they fought for their youngest daughter's life with the same determination they'd once fought for Emma's during the scarlet fever outbreak. The irony wasn't lost on them. Two of the territory's most respected physicians nearly losing their own child to a disease they'd treated in hundreds of others. "It's different when it's your own," Nathaniel said during one of the long nights, his voice hollow with exhaustion as they took turns monitoring Hope's labored breathing. "It's always different when it's your own," Clara replied, remembering her own words from years ago when Emma had been sick. "That's what makes us human, not just healers." Hope recovered, though it left her with a weakness in her lungs that would require careful monitoring. The experience bonded the family even closer, if such a thing were possible, and gave Clara new insights that she brought to her teaching. "Physicians must never forget that every patient is someone's hope," she told her class of nursing students, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Someone's entire world lying in that hospital bed. Her classes at the medical college were revolutionary. While other professors lectured from dusty texts, Clara brought in actual patients, with their permission, to demonstrate examination techniques and treatment approaches. She insisted her students spend as much time in the wards as in the classroom, scandalizing the more traditional faculty members. "Mrs. Ward, excuse me, Dr. Ward," the dean corrected himself during one faculty meeting, though Clara could hear the reluctance in his voice. "Your methods are rather unconventional." "Medicine is evolving, Dean Morrison. Shouldn't our teaching evolve with it? But having young ladies examine male patients, even supervised, these young ladies, as you call them, will be treating male patients when they graduate. Would you rather they learn proper techniques here or make mistakes in the field?" The dean had no good answer for that, though Clara knew she was making enemies among the old guard. Change always did. Meanwhile, Nathaniel had found unexpected purpose in his consulting role. Unable to perform lengthy surgeries, he'd become the territory's foremost diagnostic physician. Doctors from across Colorado brought him their most puzzling cases, and his combination of vast knowledge and hard-won empathy made him extraordinarily effective. "I received an interesting letter today," he told Clara one evening as spring touched Denver with tentative warmth. They were sitting in their garden, watching Thomas prepare for his final medical school examinations, while Emma debated constitutional law with anyone who would listen. "Oh." "From Johns Hopkins. They want me to write a textbook on diagnostic medicine. They're particularly interested in my approaches to treating chronic pain, given my personal experience." Clara studied her husband's face. The years had marked him, silver threading through his dark hair, lines carved by pain and laughter around his eyes, the ever-present cane that had become as much a part of him as his medical bag. But there was a light in his expression she hadn't seen since before the accident. "You want to do it?" "I do. But it would mean less time for consultations, less income. Nathaniel Ward, when have we ever made decisions based solely on income? Write your book, share what you've learned. That's how knowledge advances." He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You took a chance on a desperate widow," Clara reminded him. "Everything else followed from that." Thomas graduated with highest honors that spring, and the entire family attended the ceremony. Watching their son receive his medical degree, Clara thought about the frightened baby she'd carried off that train in Riverbend. Now he stood tall and confident, ready to carry forward the tradition of healing his parents had established. "I've been accepted to a surgical residency in Boston," Thomas announced at the celebration dinner. "Dr. Morrison from Chicago Presbyterian recommended me." Clara felt a pang at the thought of her son moving so far away, but also pride. "Boston's an excellent choice." "I'll come back," Thomas promised, "after I've learned everything they can teach me. The West needs surgeons who understand frontier medicine. The West needs doctors who understand people," Nathaniel corrected. "Never forget that behind every symptom is a human being with fears, hopes, stories. That's what your mother taught me." Emma, not to be outdone by her brother, announced she'd been accepted to study law at the University of Michigan, one of the few institutions that admitted women to their law program. "I'm going to specialize in medical law," she said. "Make sure doctors like you and Mama have legal protection to practice as you see fit." "And Hope?" Clara asked, turning to her youngest, now 17 and blooming into a young woman who looked remarkably like Clara had at that age. I've been accepted at the Art Institute of Chicago, Hope said quietly. But also, she produced a letter from her portfolio. The Territorial Hospital Board wants to commission me to create anatomical illustrations for medical texts. I could stay in Denver, work with you and Papa, and study art privately. What do you want to do? Nathaniel asked. Hope looked between her parents. I want to stay. At least for now. I've spent my whole life surrounded by medicine and art. Why not combine them? And so their family evolved, expanding and contracting like a living thing. Thomas left for Boston with a trunk full of medical texts and his grandmother's Bible, Clara's mother's, which had somehow survived all their moves. Emma departed for Michigan with fierce determination and a letter of introduction from the territorial governor. Hope set up a studio in their Denver home, creating illustrations that would eventually appear in medical texts across the country. The house felt empty without the older children, but Clara and Nathaniel found unexpected joy in rediscovering each other without the constant demands of parenting. They took long walks in the Denver parks, his pace slow but steady. They attended the opera, something they'd never had access to in Riverbend. They made love on Sunday afternoons like newlyweds, working around his physical limitations with creativity and laughter. We're entering a new chapter, Clara said one such afternoon, tracing the scars on Nathaniel's chest, reminders of all they'd survived. Are we? And what's this chapter called? The distinguished years, Clara decided, where we become the wise elders everyone seeks advice from. Nathaniel laughed. Speak for yourself. I plan to remain rakishly handsome and only moderately wise, But wisdom found them whether they sought it or not. Clara's reputation as an educator grew, and she was invited to speak at medical conferences across the country. She always insisted on bringing Nathaniel, whose textbook had become the definitive guide for diagnostic medicine. It was at one such conference in Philadelphia where they encountered an unexpected ghost from the past. Clara was preparing for her keynote address when a familiar figure appeared in the doorway of the preparation room. Clara! She turned to find Margaret Winters, now Margaret something else, judging by the wedding ring, Edward Collins' former fiancée from before he'd placed his advertisement for a mail-order bride. The years had been kind to Margaret. She was elegantly dressed and carried herself with confidence. Margaret, Clara said carefully, I didn't expect to see you here. I married a doctor, Dr. Whitman from Baltimore. He's presenting on surgical techniques. Margaret paused, seeming to gather courage. I owe you an apology. You owe me nothing. No, I do. When Edward threw you over for me all those years ago, before you even arrived in Riverbend, I knew about the advertisement. I knew he'd promised to marry you, but I wanted security, respectability, and I didn't care who got hurt. Clara studied the woman before her. But you didn't marry him. No. After seeing how he treated you at the station, yes, I was there, hidden in the crowd, I realized what kind of man he really was. I broke our engagement that very day. He was furious, said I'd ruined him, but I couldn't marry someone capable of such cruelty. And now you're a doctor's wife after all. Margaret smiled ruefully. The difference is, Henry married me for love, not convenience. We have 3 children, a good life. But I've always wondered what became of you after that terrible day. I became myself, Clara said simply. That rejection led to everything good in my life. Margaret's eyes widened as she took in Clara's conference badge, identifying her as Dr. Clara Ward, keynote speaker. You're the Dr. Ward? The one revolutionizing nursing education? My husband speaks of your work with awe. I'm one of the doctors, Ward, Clara corrected with a smile. My husband, Nathaniel, is the other. The diagnostic specialist? The author of Principles of Modern Diagnosis? You married him? He married me, Clara said, despite considerable opposition from people like Edward Collins. Margaret shook her head in wonder. You triumphed over everything. Edward died in prison, you know, alone and bitter. While you... She gestured at the conference hall where hundreds waited to hear Clara speak. You became everything he said you couldn't be. I became everything I was meant to be, Clara corrected. Edward's rejection simply cleared the path. They parted cordially, and Clara took the stage for her address with renewed purpose. She spoke about the future of nursing education, about the need to treat nurses as medical professionals rather than mere servants. She talked about the importance of practical experience, of compassion combined with competence. And she told her own story, the widow at the train station who became a professor of medicine, as an example of why limiting women's opportunities limited medicine itself. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying, but what touched Clara most was Nathaniel waiting in the wings, pride shining in his eyes, despite the pain she knew he was experiencing from standing so long. "You were magnificent," he said, pulling her into his arms. "We were magnificent," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you believing in me. You would have found a way. You always do." That night, in their Philadelphia hotel, they received a telegram that would change everything once again. It was from Captain Brooks in Riverbend, and its message was brief but urgent. "Martha Grant dying. Asks for you. Come quickly." They left Philadelphia immediately, taking the first train west. The journey felt both endless and too quick, memories flooding back with each mile. Clara thought of Martha opening her door to a desperate stranger, offering shelter without questions. Nathaniel remembered Martha backing their marriage when the whole town gossiped, standing as witness when they needed respectability. They arrived in Riverbend to find it much changed. The town had grown, with paved streets and electric lights, a proper hospital where their old practice had stood. But Martha's boarding house looked exactly the same. Yellow paint, perhaps a bit faded, but still cheerful. Martha lay in the same room she'd given Clara that first night, and the parallel wasn't lost on anyone. She was tiny in the bed, her once robust frame diminished by age and illness, but her eyes were still sharp when they opened to find Clara and Nathaniel beside her. "You came," she whispered. "Of course we came," Clara said, taking the weathered hand in both of hers. "Your family." "Family," Martha repeated with a slight smile. "Yes, that's what I wanted to talk to you about." She gestured weakly to a box on the dresser. "Open it." Inside, Clara found legal documents, photographs, and a letter addressed to her. With trembling fingers, she read Martha's final wishes. The boarding house was to become a residence for women studying medicine or nursing, funded by Martha's considerable savings. Clara and Nathaniel were named as trustees. "Martha, this is necessary," Martha interrupted with some of her old fire. "This house sheltered you when you needed it most. Now it can shelter other women finding their way. Full circle, Clara. Everything comes full circle." She died 2 days later, peacefully, with Clara holding one hand and Nathaniel the other. The funeral drew hundreds. Every life Martha had touched with her gruff kindness, her practical wisdom, her unfailing support for the underdog. "She was the first person to show me kindness here," Clara said at the service. "When I had nothing, she gave me everything: shelter, dignity, hope. Every success I've achieved started with Martha Grant opening her door to a stranger." They stayed in Riverbend for 2 weeks, setting up the Martha Grant Residence for Women in Medicine. The first resident was a young woman from Kansas, arriving with a single suitcase and dreams of becoming a doctor. Clara met her at the train station, the same platform where her own story had begun, and saw herself reflected in the girl's determined eyes. "Welcome to Riverbend," Clara said. "This town has a way of transforming lives, if you're brave enough to let it." Returning to Denver, they found Hope in a state of excitement. Her illustrations had been selected for a groundbreaking anatomy textbook, and she'd received a commission from the Smithsonian to document surgical procedures in detailed drawings. "They want me to travel to various hospitals, observe, and create a comprehensive visual record," she explained, her eyes shining. "It's a 2-year project." "That's wonderful, darling," Clara said, though her heart ached at the thought of her last child leaving. "I want to start in Boston," Hope continued. "Thomas says I can observe his surgeries. Then Michigan, where Emma's working on a case about women's rights to practice medicine. I'll be documenting our family's work across the country." "A family legacy in pictures," Nathaniel said approvingly. "Your siblings will be thrilled." They were. Thomas wrote excitedly about showing his sister the innovative techniques he was developing. Emma promised to introduce Hope to women breaking barriers in various fields. The ward children, scattered across the country, would be united through Hope's art. The house grew quiet without Hope's gentle presence. her artist's eye that saw beauty in everything. Clara and Nathaniel rattled around the too large space, adjusting to being truly alone together for the first time in their marriage. We could downsize, Nathaniel suggested one evening, find something smaller, more manageable. Or, Clara said slowly, we could fill it differently. What do you mean? I've been thinking about Martha's legacy, about providing shelter for those who need it. What if we opened our home to medical students who can't afford lodging, not as a boarding house, but as a mentorship program? Nathaniel's face lit up. Young doctors living here, learning not just from textbooks, but from experience? Exactly. We have the space, we have the knowledge, and God knows we have the experience. Why not share it? Within 6 months, the ward mentorship program was established. 3 carefully selected students lived in their home, receiving not just room and board, but intensive tutoring, practical experience, and most importantly, lessons in the humanity of medicine that no textbook could provide. One of their first residents was a young black woman named Sarah Washington, whose brilliance had earned her admission to the medical college, but who faced discrimination at every turn. No respectable boarding house would accept her, and many professors refused to call on her in class. They see my skin before they see my mind, Sarah said during her interview, chin raised defiantly despite the tears threatening her eyes. Then they're fools, Claire said firmly, and their foolishness is our gain. When can you move in? Sarah flourished under their mentorship, her natural gifts nurtured in an environment free from prejudice. She would go on to become one of Denver's most respected physicians, but Clara always remembered her as the shy girl who cried with relief at being welcomed into their home. Another resident was James Chen, a Chinese immigrant whose father had built railroads and who dreamed of building something different, a bridge between Eastern and Western medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine has wisdom Western doctors ignore, he argued passionately during one dinner discussion. Then teach us, Nathaniel said simply. Knowledge has no borders. These young people brought vitality back into the ward home. Dinner discussions ranged from surgical techniques to philosophical debates about the nature of healing. Clara found herself energized by their questions, their challenges to conventional thinking, their fresh perspectives on old problems. We're not just teaching them, she told Nathaniel one night as they listened to their residents engaged in animated discussion downstairs. They're teaching us too. Keeping us young, he agreed, though his body told a different story. The years of managing chronic pain had taken their toll. He moved slower now, needed more rest, though his mind remained sharp as ever. It was during a particularly harsh winter that Nathaniel's heart began to fail. The first attack was mild, chest pain during a consultation that he initially dismissed as indigestion. But Clara knew better, recognized the signs she'd seen in too many patients. You need to reduce your workload, she said after examining him, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Clara, no arguments. You've spent 30 years taking care of others. Let others take care of you now. He did, grudgingly, cutting back on consultations and focusing on writing. His second textbook, The Human Element in Medicine, became his masterwork, part memoir, part medical text, part philosophy. He dedicated it to Clara, who taught me that healing begins with seeing the person, not just the patient. Thomas returned from Boston that Christmas, now a skilled surgeon with gentle hands and their father's diagnostic instincts. Emma came from Michigan, where she'd just won a landmark case establishing women's rights to practice medicine without restriction. Hope arrived from Washington, her portfolio full of illustrations that would define medical texts for a generation. Look at you all, Nathaniel said from his chair by the fire, Clara beside him. Look what you've become. Look what you made us, Thomas corrected. No, Clara said. Look what we all made together. A family that believes in possibility, in fighting for what's right, in lifting others as we climb. That night, after their children had gone to bed, Nathaniel and Clara sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of years a warm blanket around them. I need to tell you something, Nathaniel said quietly. Clara's heart clenched. She knew that tone. How long? Dr. Morrison gives me perhaps a year. Maybe less. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the world tilt as it had that day she'd received the telegram about his accident. But this time, there would be no dramatic recovery, no rehabilitation program to beat the odds. Then we make it the best year possible, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Clara, no, we don't waste whatever time we have on grief for what we're losing. We celebrate what we've had, what we still have. They told the children after New Year's, gathering them in the study where so many family decisions had been made. The tears were expected, the denial too, but ultimately the ward children responded as their parents had taught them, with determination to make the most of whatever time remained. Thomas extended his stay, taking a position at Denver General to be close. Emma found reasons to visit monthly, bringing legal briefs she could work on anywhere. Hope moved back home entirely, setting up her studio where she could be near her father, and they had 9 beautiful months. Months where Nathaniel, freed from the pretense of recovery, focused on what mattered most. He completed his book, taught their residents with renewed passion, and spent hours with Clara, talking, remembering, planning for a future he wouldn't see but she would carry forward. "Promise me something," he said one autumn afternoon as they sat in the garden, the aspens golden around them. "Anything. Don't stop. When I'm gone, don't stop teaching, mentoring, pushing boundaries. The world needs Dr. Clara Ward." "The world had 2 Doctors Ward," she reminded him, "and will remember both. But you have more to do still. Promise me." "I promise." He died as the first snows of winter touched Denver, peacefully, with his family around him. His last words were for Clara alone, whispered as dawn broke. "Thank you for saving me that day you walked into my office. Thank you for our life." The funeral drew hundreds, patients, colleagues, students, the lives he'd touched across decades of service. But Clara found her greatest comfort in a letter he'd left for her, to be opened after his death. "My dearest Clara," it read, "if you're reading this, then our earthly journey together has ended. But what a journey it's been. From that moment you stood in my office, determined and desperate in equal measure, you've made every day an adventure. You took a broken man and helped him heal. You took an empty practice and made it a beacon of hope. You took my name and made it mean something more than I ever could have alone. I know you'll grieve, but don't grieve too long. You have work still to do, boundaries still to break, young minds still to shape. And someday, when your work is done, we'll meet again, and you can tell me all about the adventures I missed. Until then, remember, you were never the desperate widow who needed saving. You were always the warrior who saved us all. Your devoted husband, now and always, Nathaniel." Claire kept her promise. She continued teaching, expanding the mentorship program, pushing for reforms in medical education. She saw women admitted to medical schools across the country, watched as her former students became leaders in their fields. She lived to see Thomas become Denver's chief of surgery, Emma argue cases before the Supreme Court, and Hope's illustrations become the definitive medical artwork of their generation. And on quiet evenings, when the house was full of young voices discussing medicine and life, Clara would sit in Nathaniel's old chair, feeling his presence still. The desperate widow who'd stepped off that train in Riverbend was a lifetime away. But Clara never forgot her. That woman's courage in the face of humiliation had started everything. Sometimes late at night, she would walk to the window and look out at the stars over Denver, thinking about the circular nature of life, how rejection had led to acceptance, how humiliation had led to honor, how desperation had led to purpose, how a chance meeting between a desperate widow and a broken doctor had created a legacy that would outlive them both. "Thank you, Edward Collins," she would whisper to the night. "Thank you for rejecting me. Thank you for setting me free to find my real life." And in the silence that followed, she could almost hear Nathaniel's chuckle, feel his hand in hers, remember his voice saying what he'd said so many times over their years together. His loss, my infinite gain. The Martha Grant Residence for Women in Medicine still stood in Riverbend, sheltering new dreamers. The Ward Mentorship Program continued in Denver, shaping new healers. The medical techs bearing their names educated new generations. Love had built something that would endure beyond any single lifetime. And Clara Ward, once Clara Hayes, once a desperate widow with $3 and 2 infants, stood as proof that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to everything we're meant to become. The train platform in Riverbend remained, would always remain, sacred ground, the place where one story ended and a better one began. The years following Nathaniel's death tested Clara in ways she hadn't anticipated. Grief was an old companion. She'd lost James, faced countless patients' deaths, weathered Nathaniel's close calls, but this loss cut differently. For 30 years, Nathaniel had been her anchor, her partner in every sense. Now, at 62, she had to learn to be singular again when she'd grown so accustomed to being plural. The first crisis came just 3 months after the funeral. The medical college board, emboldened by Nathaniel's absence, moved to terminate her teaching position. "We appreciate your years of service," Dean Morrison said during the meeting, not quite meeting her eyes, "but perhaps it's time for you to consider retirement. A widow your age, surely you'd prefer to rest, spend time with your grandchildren." Clara stood slowly, her black morning dress rustling in the silent room. "My grandchildren?" "Dean Morrison, my oldest child is 37 and unmarried, devoted entirely to surgery. My daughters are similarly focused on their careers. I have no grandchildren to dandle on my knee. What I have is 30 years of medical experience and hundreds of students waiting to learn." "Are you truly suggesting that my husband's death has somehow diminished my ability to teach?" "It's not about ability," another board member interjected. "It's about propriety. You were acceptable as part of a married couple, but a widow, alone, teaching young men." "The same young men I've been teaching for 15 years. Clara's voice could have frozen flame. "Gentlemen, I buried my husband, not my brain. If you force me out, you'll need to explain to the territorial governor why you've dismissed your most successful professor, the one whose students have the highest examination scores, the one who brings in the most funding through her revolutionary programs." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You have 1 week to reconsider. After that, I'll take my programs, my funding, and my expertise to whichever institution is smart enough to value knowledge over prejudice." The board reconsidered. Clara kept her position, but she knew she'd won a battle, not the war. They would watch for any excuse to remove her, any sign of weakness or impropriety. She would give them neither. The mentorship program became her salvation. The young doctors living in her home gave it life and purpose when memories threatened to overwhelm her. One evening, she found Sarah Washington in Nathaniel's study, poring over his diagnostic textbook. "He writes about reading the whole patient," Sarah said without looking up. "Not just symptoms, but context, history, fears. It's revolutionary." "He learned that the hard way," Clara said, entering the room she'd barely been able to face since his death. After his accident, when he was the patient, he understood how fear and pain color everything, how a kind word could be as important as morphine. "You must miss him terribly." "Every moment. But he's here too, in these pages, in the techniques you're learning, in the way you'll treat your patients because of what he taught." Sarah looked up, her dark eyes serious. "Dr. Ward, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "How did you do it?" "Face down all the prejudice, the dismissals, the attempts to diminish you. I face it every day, and sometimes I think about giving up." Clara sat in Nathaniel's chair, the leather still holding the impression of his body. "I almost did give up once. I stood on a train platform with 2 babies and $3, having been publicly rejected and humiliated. But a woman named Martha Grant showed me kindness, and then Nathaniel gave me a chance, and I realized something important." "What?" "That their prejudice was about their limitations, not mine. Every time someone said I couldn't or shouldn't, I took it as a challenge to prove I could and would. But more than that, I had someone who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. So that's what I'll be for you, Sarah. The person who believes until you can carry that belief yourself." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Even though I'm brilliant? Dedicated? Capable?" "Yes, despite all those things," Clara said with a small smile. "Your skin color is no more relevant to your medical ability than my gender is to mine. Anyone who thinks otherwise is a fool, and we don't have time for fools." That night, Clara wrote in the journal she'd started keeping after Nathaniel's death, a way to continue their conversations. "Today I understood why you insisted I continue. It's not just about medicine or teaching, it's about passing on what Martha gave us, the gift of being seen for who we truly are." Spring brought unexpected news from Thomas. He arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning, finding Clara teaching a practical demonstration in the college's surgical theater. She knew immediately something was wrong. Thomas never missed scheduled surgeries without significant reason. We need to talk, he said quietly. They walked to her office, and Clara's heart clenched at how much Thomas looked like Nathaniel. The same thoughtful eyes, the same way of gathering his thoughts before speaking. I've been offered the position of chief of surgery at Massachusetts General, he said. It's unprecedented for someone my age. They want me to establish a new trauma surgery program. Thomas, that's wonderful. I'm not taking it. Clara studied her son's face. Why? Because I've also received another offer. From Riverbend. They want me to return, to run the hospital there, to carry on what you and Papa started. He paused. And because there's someone there. Someone I've been corresponding with since the funeral. Who? Mary Sullivan. You taught her. She was one of your first nursing students. She runs the surgical ward at Riverbend now. We've been writing for months, and I want to court her properly. But I wanted your blessing first. Clara felt Nathaniel's absence acutely in that moment. This was a conversation they should have had together. But she also felt his presence in Thomas's respectful manner, in his prioritizing love over prestige. Your father would tell you that Massachusetts General will always be there, but chances at love are rarer than surgical positions, Clara said. Follow your heart, Thomas. It's what we did. Even though Riverbend is smaller, less prestigious, your father and I built something meaningful in Riverbend with nothing but determination and love. You have so much more to start with. Thomas left for Riverbend 2 weeks later, and within 6 months, Clara received a wedding invitation. She stood in the same church where she'd married Nathaniel, watching her son marry a woman who looked at him the way she'd looked at his father, with respect, love, and partnership in her eyes. Emma arrived for the wedding with news of her own. I'm being considered for a federal judgeship, she said as they dressed for the ceremony. The first woman in the territory. Emma, that's extraordinary. It's controversial. There's significant opposition. They're saying a woman can't be impartial, that I'll be too emotional. Emma's jaw set in a way that reminded Clara of herself facing down the medical board. I need to prove them wrong. No, Clara corrected. You need to be so excellent they can't deny you despite their prejudice. There's a difference. The wedding was beautiful, with Hope's artistic eye evident in every detail. Mary Sullivan, now Mary Ward, was radiant, and Thomas looked at her the way Nathaniel had looked at Clara. During the reception, held in the same hall where Clara had once been shunned as the rejected mail-order bride, she found herself approached by an elderly woman she didn't recognize. You don't remember me, the woman said. I'm Mrs. Patterson, not Sally, her mother. I was there that day at the train station when Edward Collins rejected you. Clara tensed, the old hurt still capable of stinging after all these years. I wanted to apologize, Mrs. Patterson continued. I stood there in that crowd watching that poor young woman with her babies being humiliated, and I did nothing. I was too afraid of Edward Collins, too worried about my own standing. I've regretted it for 30 years. Your daughter Sally saved my children during Edward's attack, Clara said softly. Whatever you didn't do, she more than made up for. She learned courage from watching you. We all did. You showed this town what strength really looked like. Mrs. Patterson squeezed Clara's hand. That scared young widow turned into the woman who changed everything. I needed you to know that we see it, we remember, and we're grateful. After the wedding, Clara returned to Denver with Hope, while Emma headed to Washington for her judgeship hearings. The house felt different now, with Thomas officially gone, starting his own family. But Hope's presence was a comfort, her quiet artistic nature a soothing counterpoint to Clara's more driven personality. I've been thinking about Papa's legacy, Hope said one evening as they sorted through Nathaniel's papers. His medical writings are important, but they don't capture him, the man he was. What do you mean? Hope produced a canvas she'd been working on, a portrait of Nathaniel, but not the formal stern image typical of the era. This showed him laughing, his head thrown back, the lines around his eyes crinkled with joy, his cane leaning forgotten against his chair. This is how I remember him, Hope said. Not the distinguished doctor or the suffering patient, but the father who made silly faces at us when Mama wasn't looking, who told terrible jokes during dinner, who cried when I showed him my first real anatomical drawing. Clara touched the canvas gently, tears blurring her vision. It's perfect. He would have complained about looking undignified, then secretly loved it. I want to do a series, Hope continued. Portraits of medical pioneers that show them as people, not just accomplishments. Starting with you. Oh, Hope, I'm no pioneer. Mother. Hope's use of the formal address, rare from her, stopped Clara's protest. You were performing complex medical procedures before women were legally allowed to vote. You established educational programs that have trained hundreds of nurses and doctors. You survived public humiliation, attempted assault, widowhood twice over, and institutional discrimination. If that's not pioneering, what is? Clara sat for the portrait over several weeks, and Hope captured something Clara had never seen in herself. Not the desperate widow or the determined doctor, but a woman who'd transmuted suffering into strength, rejection into revolution. The painting would eventually hang in the National Medical Library, but first it was displayed at the Territorial Medical Conference, where Clara was being honored for her 40 years of service. She stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, many of them women who wouldn't have been there without the paths she'd helped carve. 40 years ago, she began, I stepped off a train in Riverbend with nothing but hope and 2 infants. I was rejected, humiliated, nearly destroyed. But I learned something that day that shaped everything since. Our lowest moments don't define us, our response to them does. She talked about Martha Grant's kindness, Nathaniel's partnership, the children they'd raised, the students they'd taught. She talked about the evolution of medicine from mystery to science, and women's roles in that transformation. We stand on the shoulders of those who believed in us when we couldn't believe in ourselves, she concluded. My husband Nathaniel once told me that healing begins with seeing the person, not just the patient. I would add that progress begins with seeing potential, not just present circumstances. Every one of you has the power to be someone's Martha Grant, someone's Nathaniel Ward, the person who sees possibility where others see problems. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Later, at the reception, Claire was approached by a young woman with a baby in her arms and a familiar look of determination mixed with desperation. Doctor. Ward. I'm Lucy Morrison. I just graduated from medical school, but I can't find anyone willing to hire a woman doctor, especially one with a child. My husband died last year, and I don't know what to do. Clara saw herself reflected in Lucy's eyes. The same fear, the same fierce need to provide for her child, the same refusal to give up despite impossible circumstances. Come to Denver, Clara said without hesitation. The mentorship program has an opening, room, board, and practical experience while you establish yourself. But I have nothing to offer in return. You have determination and talent, or you wouldn't have graduated. That's enough. Clara smiled, remembering Martha's words from so long ago. We don't always pay debts backward, Lucy. Sometimes we pay them forward. Lucy Morrison would go on to become one of Denver's most celebrated physicians, but Clara would always remember her as the young widow with frightened eyes who needed someone to believe in her. Emma's judgeship was confirmed that autumn, despite fierce opposition. Clara attended the swearing-in ceremony in the territorial capital, pride swelling as her daughter took the oath. Afterward, at the reception, Emma pulled her aside. There's something I need to tell you, Emma said. I'm in love. Clara's eyebrows rose. Emma had shown so little interest in romance that the family had assumed she'd remain married to the law. Who? Robert Henley. He's a professor of constitutional law. We've been debating legal theory for 2 years, and somewhere in the arguments, I fell in love. He asked me to marry him, but I wanted to wait until after the confirmation. I didn't want anyone saying I got the position because of a man's influence. And now? Now I'm established enough that no one can claim I'm anything but my own woman. We're planning a small wedding this spring. Your father would be delighted, Clara said. He always said you'd only fall for someone who could match your intellect. Robert can. He actually wins some of our arguments, which is infuriating and attractive in equal measure. They married in Denver, with Clara officiating. She'd gotten ordained through a progressive church specifically for the occasion. Watching Emma, brilliant and fierce in her wedding suit, she'd refused a traditional dress. Exchange vows with a man who looked at her with awe rather than intimidation, Clara felt Nathaniel's presence strongly. 2 down, 1 to go. Hope whispered beside her. You're in no rush, Clara whispered back. Actually, Hope said, and Clara heard something in her tone that made her turn. Hope Elizabeth Ward, are you keeping secrets? After the ceremony, Hope promised. Later, as the reception wound down, Hope introduced Clara to a man she'd seen at various art exhibitions, William Blake, a sculptor and painter who'd been courting Hope quietly for months. I wanted to be sure before I said anything, Hope explained. William understands that my art, my medical illustration work is part of who I am. He doesn't want to change that. I want to support it, William said earnestly. Hope's work is revolutionary, the intersection of art and science. I'd be a fool to want her to give that up for conventional domesticity. They married a year later, and Clara began to feel the strange sensation of her life coming full circle. Her children were all established, all happy, all carrying forward the values she and Nathaniel had instilled. The desperate widow at the train station could never have imagined this, not just survival, but flourishing across generations. It was Thomas who brought the news that would shake Clara from any thought of comfortable retirement. He arrived in Denver unexpectedly, his face grave. There's a typhoid outbreak in Riverbend, he said. It's bad, Mother. Really bad. We've lost 12 people already, including 2 of my nurses. Mary's sick too. Clara was packing before he finished speaking. What do you need? You. Your experience with epidemics. We're overwhelmed, and people are panicking. They traveled through the night, and Clara found Riverbend in the grip of fear. The hospital was overflowing, and Thomas looked exhausted, reminding her painfully of Nathaniel during the scarlet fever outbreak years ago. Mary was critically ill, and Clara took over her care personally, while Thomas managed the other patients. For 5 days, they fought for Mary's life the way Clara and Nathaniel had once fought for Emma's, for Hope's. And like those times, they won, though it was close. I saw James, Mary whispered when her fever finally broke. My first husband. He said it wasn't time, that I had too much work left to do. Clara smoothed the young woman's hair, remembering her own fever dreams during illness, the sense of standing at a threshold between worlds. The work is never done, dear one. That's what keeps us here. The outbreak lasted 3 weeks, and Clara stayed for all of it, working alongside Thomas, teaching the newer nurses techniques she'd learned over decades. Together, they implemented sanitation measures that finally broke the disease's hold on the town. You saved us, Thomas said, as they stood in the cemetery, looking at the fresh graves, fewer than there might have been without Clara's intervention, but still too many. We saved what we could, Clara corrected. That's all anyone can do. She stayed another month, helping Mary recover fully and watching with satisfaction as Thomas ran the hospital with the same combination of competence and compassion she and Nathaniel had tried to model. The torch had truly passed to the next generation. But the typhoid outbreak had taken a toll on Clara too. She'd pushed herself hard, ignoring the chest pains that came with exertion, the shortness of breath that climbing stairs now caused. She was 71 years old, though she'd never felt it until now. Back in Denver, she visited Dr. Morrison, the son of the Chicago doctor who'd treated Nathaniel. He examined her thoroughly, his face growing increasingly concerned. Your heart is struggling, he said finally. The strain of the outbreak, your age, the accumulated stress of your life, it's catching up with you. How long? If you rest, avoid strain, perhaps years. If you continue at your current pace, months, maybe less. Clara considered this. And if I split the difference? Reduce my teaching load but continue the mentorship program? A year, perhaps 2. She thought of Nathaniel's final year, how he'd used it purposefully, tying up loose ends, passing on knowledge, saying what needed to be said. Then I'd better make them count. She reorganized her life with the same efficiency she'd once organized medical supplies. She reduced her teaching to twice weekly, focusing on practical demonstrations rather than lengthy lectures. She formalized the mentorship program's structure so it could continue without her constant oversight. She began writing her memoirs, though she called them practical lessons from a frontier practice. Most importantly, she spent time with her children and the families they were building. Thomas and Mary announced they were expecting their first child. Emma and Robert were working together on legal reforms for medical practice. Hope was pregnant with her second child, having given birth to a daughter, Clara's first grandchild the year before. You'll have 2 grandchildren to dote on, Hope said, placing Clara's hand on her expanding belly. This one feels like a fighter, always kicking. All the Ward children are fighters, Clara said. It's in the blood. That Christmas, the entire family gathered in Denver. Thomas and a heavily pregnant Mary, Emma and Robert, Hope with William and little Margaret. The house that had felt so empty after Nathaniel's death was full of life and laughter. Tell us the story, Thomas requested after dinner. The real story, start to finish. Clara had told pieces over the years, sanitized versions for the children when they were young, professional anecdotes for students, but never the whole truth, raw and unvarnished. So she told them everything. The desperation that had driven her to answer Edward Collins' advertisement. The humiliation of that rejection. Standing on the platform with her babies and nothing else. Martha's rescue. Nathaniel's unexpected kindness. The fights for recognition. The threats from Edward. The slow building of trust that became love. I spent so long thinking I was unlucky, she concluded. Losing James, being rejected by Edward, facing all that prejudice. But every loss led to something better. Every rejection redirected me toward my actual life. If Edward Collins had accepted me, I'd have died slowly in a loveless marriage. Instead, his cruelty freed me to find everything: love, purpose, partnership, all of you. To Edward Collins, then, Emma said, raising her glass with typical lawyer's irony. May he know, wherever his spirit resides, that his moment of cruelty created a medical dynasty. They toasted, laughing, but Clara felt the truth of it. From that single moment of rejection had grown this family, these accomplishments, this legacy that would outlive them all. Mary went into labor that night, as if the baby had been waiting for the whole family to be present. Clara, despite her weakness, insisted on attending the birth alongside Thomas. The baby arrived just after midnight, a boy, healthy and loud. What will you name him? Clara asked, holding her grandson while Mary recovered. Nathaniel James Ward, Thomas said, for the grandfathers he'll never meet, but whose legacy he'll carry. Clara looked down at the infant, seeing traces of Nathaniel in the nose, of James in the chin, of herself in the determined grip of tiny fingers. 4 generations in her arms, herself, the desperate widow. Thomas, the baby she'd carried onto that train. And now this child, born into a world where his grandmother was a respected doctor, where his mother could practice medicine, where the barriers she'd fought might not even exist for him. Hello, little one, she whispered. You've been born into a family that believes in impossible things. Don't ever forget that. She lived to see that grandson take his first steps, to welcome Emma's first child, a daughter named Clara Martha, after the 2 women who'd shaped their family's destiny. She lived to see Hope's son born, named William Nathaniel, carrying both family names forward. But she felt herself fading as 1900 turned to 1901, the new century dawning with promises she wouldn't see fulfilled. Her heart, which had carried her through so much, was finally wearing out. She made her peace methodically. She wrote letters for her grandchildren to open on their 18th birthdays. She finalized the endowment for the Martha Grant residence, ensuring it would continue indefinitely. She met with each of her mentorship students, passing on final lessons, encouraging them to become mentors themselves. On a March morning, she woke knowing it was her last day. She could feel it in the struggle of her heart, the weight in her chest. She asked Hope to bring all the children, and they came, Thomas and Mary with their boys, Emma and Robert with baby Clara, Hope and William with their children. I need you all to understand something, she said, her voice still clear despite her body's weakness. Our family was built on rejection and redemption. Every one of you exists because a cruel man rejected me at a train station. Never forget that our greatest disasters can become our greatest gifts, but only if we have the courage to transform them. She looked at each of her children in turn. Thomas, you have your father's hands and his heart. Use them to heal. Emma, you have my stubbornness and your father's brilliance. Use them to fight for justice. Hope, you have the artist's eye that sees beauty where others see only function. Use it to teach. To her grandchildren, too young to understand but old enough to remember, she said, you come from people who didn't accept limitations. Don't you accept them either. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Clara closed her eyes for the last time. Her children would say she smiled at the end, as if seeing something beautiful beyond their sight. Some would insist they heard her whisper, "Nathaniel," with her last breath. The funeral was held in Denver, but she was buried in Riverbend, beside Nathaniel and near Martha Grant. The entire territory seemed to attend. Patients she'd treated, students she'd taught, women she'd inspired, families she'd saved. Judge Morrison, ancient but still sharp, gave the eulogy. Clara Ward was rejected at our train station 58 years ago. That rejection became our redemption. She showed us what we could be when we looked beyond prejudice to possibility. She and Nathaniel built more than a medical practice. They built a vision of what medicine could be when it remembered humanity. Thomas spoke of her as a mother, Emma as a pioneer, Hope as an artist of life itself. But it was Lucy Morrison, the young widow Clara had taken in years before, who perhaps captured her best. Dr. Ward saw me at my lowest moment and didn't see failure. She saw future. That's what she did for everyone. She looked at desperate circumstances and saw opportunity. She looked at rejection and saw redirection. She looked at limitations and saw challenges to overcome. She taught us that the worst moments of our lives are just doorways waiting for us to be brave enough to walk through. The Ward Medical Legacy Foundation was established that year, providing education for women in medicine. The Clara Ward Memorial Wing was added to the Denver Hospital. Medical texts included her innovations in nursing education. But perhaps her truest memorial was in the hundreds of healers she'd trained, who trained others, spreading her philosophy of compassionate competence across the growing nation. In 1920, when women finally got the vote, Emma stood in the Supreme Court as the first female justice, holding her mother's memoir. In 1925, when Thomas performed the territory's first heart surgery, he used techniques his mother had theorized but never lived to see proven. In 1930, when Hope's medical illustrations were displayed at the World's Fair, the portrait of Clara held the center position, the desperate widow transformed into medical pioneer. And in Riverbend, the train station still stood. A plaque was eventually placed on the platform. Here in 1867, Clara Hayes was rejected and Clara Ward was born. From humiliation came healing. From desperation came determination. From one woman's courage came countless lives saved. Young medical students would stand on that platform, reading the plaque, trying to imagine the frightened woman with 2 babies and $3 who transformed rejection into revolution. They couldn't quite picture her. The desperate widow seemed too far removed from the legendary Dr. Ward, but Clara would have understood. She'd stood on that same platform, unable to imagine the future that awaited her. She'd thought she was at an ending when she was really at a beginning. She'd believed she needed saving when really she was about to save herself and countless others. The truth was simple, and Clara had lived it. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you, but only if you have the courage to transform disaster into destiny. Edward Collins had meant to destroy her. Instead, he'd freed her to become everything she was meant to be. The Ward family continued to grow, spreading across the country, each generation carrying forward the lessons of that day at the train station. That rejection isn't always loss, that humiliation can become strength, that love earned through struggle is stronger than love given without thought. And somewhere, in whatever exists beyond this life, Clara and Nathaniel were together again, whole and healthy, watching their legacy unfold, probably arguing about diagnostic techniques and definitely still choosing each other, over and over, forever and always. Their love story proof that the best romances aren't the ones that start perfectly, but the ones that transform imperfection into something extraordinary.